It's always great having you here. Climbing Mount Everest takes courage, but courage without common sense can be just as deadly as the mountain itself. Join me as I go through the dumbest Everest attempts ever recorded. From expert climbers who rejected life-saving oxygen just to prove a point, to ambitious adventurers who trusted an unqualified guide to save money. Both ignored warnings that existed for one reason: to keep them alive.
It was June 24th, 2022, and high on the descent of Denali, above 18,000 feet, on an icy traverse that has killed more people than any other place on the mountain, two women who were never supposed to be there at all were starting to understand that no one was coming for them, because no one even knew they were on the mountain. Their names were Cecilia Castellano and Lacey Frey, and they were both in their late 30s, and they had built a life and a following around being strong. They ran a wellness brand together, the kind that fills your screen with green smoothies and sunrise yoga and captions about pushing past your limits. And they had hundreds of thousands of people who watched them do it. They had built it from nothing over a decade. From a small local studio into a real business with retreats and a clothing line and a podcast, all of it powered by a single irresistible message that you are stronger than you think and the only thing stopping you is your own fear. It is a beautiful message, and for a lot of their followers, it was exactly the push they needed to change their lives. The trouble is that it is a message about the gym and the yoga mat and the marathon, places where pushing past fear is the right move, and they had started to believe it applied everywhere to every challenge, including the ones where fear is not an obstacle to overcome, but information you are supposed to listen to. They were both mothers, both married, both the kind of women other women messaged at midnight to say, "You changed my life." They were seriously, powerfully fit, the kind of fit that runs marathons for fun and holds a forearm stand for 2 minutes without shaking, and they had spent a decade turning that fitness into an identity and a business and a source of endless quiet pride. Every challenge they had ever set themselves, they had crushed. Every doubter, they had proven wrong. And somewhere along the way, in all that strength and all that praise, they had come to believe a thing that the mountains punish more cruelly than almost anything else. The belief that being in great shape and being ready for Denali were the same thing. They were not the same thing. They were not even close, and the gap between them is exactly where this story lives. They announced it to their followers the way they announced everything, as a triumph already half won. There was the video from the Airy studio, the two of them in matching gear, talking about the next big challenge, the highest peak in North America, a test of everything they had built their bodies and their brand around. They talked about doing it their own way, no big guided group, no hand-holding, just the two of them and the mountain, because that was the whole point, that was the message, that was the brand. They framed it as empowerment, as two women refusing to be told they needed a man or a guide or a rule to do something extraordinary. They listed the gear sponsors, they posted a countdown, they told everyone to follow along, promised photos from the summit, and called it the most empowering thing two women could possibly do. Not once in any of it did they mention training on a glacier, or learning crevasse rescue, or spending a single day being taught how this specific mountain kills people, because they never had, and it never occurred to them that they needed to. I want to be clear about something, because it matters. These were not lazy people. They were incredibly fit, and that is exactly the trap. Because Denali does not test your fitness, it tests whether or not you belong there. To understand what they were walking into, you have to understand Denali. It stands 20,310 feet above Alaska, the highest mountain in North America. And because it sits so far north, much closer to the pole than the great peaks of the Himalaya, the air at its summit feels thinner and cooler than mountains of the same height closer to the equator. Your body behaves as though you are even higher than you are. The cold is almost beyond description, with temperatures near the top dropping far below zero even in summer, and winds that can tear across the upper slopes at over 100 miles an hour, fast enough to flatten tents and freeze exposed skin in minutes. It is a mountain of glaciers and hidden crevasses, deep cracks in the ice often bridged by a thin lid of snow that looks exactly like solid ground until the moment it is not. It has steep ice, long exposed ridges, and a single icy traverse on the descent that has killed more people than any other spot on the mountain. More than 100 climbers have died on Denali, and here is the detail that matters most for this story. Most of them did not die going up. They died coming down, exhausted, depleted, on the long descent, in exactly the place Cecilia and Lacey were about to find themselves with nothing left. Over 100 people have died on this mountain, and most of them died on the way down, not the way up. I think about that every time someone tells me that the summit is the hard part. Here is the part that makes this story so hard to take. Climbing Denali is not something you are allowed to just walk up and do. The law requires every climber on the mountain to register with the National Park Service at least 60 days in advance, pay a fee, and attend an in-person orientation with a ranger where they check your experience, inspect your gear, and walk you through exactly how the mountain kills people. The air taxis that fly climbers to the standard base camp are part of that system, and they will not fly a registered Denali climber in until the paperwork and the ranger check are done. It is the single best safety net the mountain has, a chance for someone who knows better to look an unprepared climber in the eye and say the words, "Please do not do this." Cecilia and Lacey got around all of it with a lie. They told the air taxi service they were flying in for a short glacier ski trip and some photography on the lower Kahiltna, the kind of recreational outing that needs no climbing permit and no ranger meeting, and they packed and talked the part well enough to be believed. Once the plane dropped them on the glacier and flew away, they simply turned toward Denali and started up the standard route on their own, onto the mountain without the permit the law required, without ever being checked, without a single ranger knowing their names, their real plan, or the date they were supposed to come home. Why they skipped it is the saddest part, because it was not laziness. It was the opposite. To them, the permit and the orientation and the ranger were obstacles, gatekeeping, the kind of bureaucratic hand holding that strong, independent women rise above. They had spent their whole careers being told that rules were for people who needed them and that the truly capable just went and did the thing. Registering felt like asking permission. Hiring a guide felt like admitting they could not do it alone, which was the entire story they were selling. So they treated the most important safety system on the mountain as an insult to their competence, and they engineered their way around it. And in doing so, they removed the one thing that has saved more Denali climbers than any rope or any helicopter, which is simply a knowledgeable person knowing you are up there and expecting you back. This is the part that haunts me most. There is a whole system built to stop exactly this. A ranger who would have looked at them and known, and they walked around it like a line at the airport. Not everyone in their life was cheering. There were messages, the kind that came out later, from a friend who had done real mountaineering and tried to talk them out of it. The friend did not lecture, just asked questions. The simple, specific questions that anyone who knows the mountains asks. Did they know how to perform a crevasse rescue? Did they know how to stop a fall on hard ice with an axe? The move called self-arrest that has to be pure reflex because there is no time to think who was their guide? Had they actually registered with the park? Cecilia answered the way confident people answer questions they do not want to hear, warmly and at length, and without ever really answering, saying they had trained harder than anyone she knew, that they had each other, that fear was just a story, and the universe protects women who bet on themselves. The friend tried once more, gently, and then stopped, because you cannot save someone who has decided that doubt is just negativity and that caution is just fear wearing a sensible coat. Those messages would later read like a warning everyone could see except the two people who needed to see it most. I want you to think about your own life for a second, but be honest. How many warnings have you talked yourself past because you were sure you would be the exception? Tell me your stories in the comments. I read every single one, believe me. They flew in on a small ski plane, dropped on the lower Kahiltna under the cover story of a ski and photography trip, and stepped out into a world of white that went on farther than either of them had ever seen, ringed by peaks and silence, and a cold that bit even in the June sun. Once the plane was gone, they shouldered their loads and turned toward Denali, starting up the standard route on their own. For the first few days, down low, their fitness actually carried them, and you can see why they believed in it. They were strong, they moved well, they hauled their heavy sleds and pitched their camps and melted their snow for water and felt, with every passing day, more certain that all the warnings had been for weaker people. They posted from the lower camps, glowing, vindicated. But the lower mountain is the kindest part of Denali. A long, snowy slog that flatters the people it is about to destroy, low enough that the air is still almost generous and the angle still almost gentle. The real mountain, the cold and the altitude and the knife-edge margins, was still far above them, waiting, and it does not flatter anyone. It simply waits for you to climb high enough that it can show you what you actually are. The posts kept coming, beamed out whenever they could find a sliver of signal, and they were everything their followers wanted to see. There were the matching jackets against the impossible white, the sunrise over the glacier turning the snow to fire, the captions about strong women and big mountains and proving the doubters wrong. They filmed themselves doing yoga poses on the snow at camp, balanced and serene in their bright gear, and it traveled across the internet as a glimpse of two fearless women conquering the wild, shared and liked, and held up as inspiration by people who had no idea what they were actually looking at. The comments filled with hearts and "You go girls," and "I wish I had your courage." What the videos never showed was the altitude already starting to work on them, the headaches they blamed on dehydration, the nights neither of them really slept, the way Lacey had started to look gray and far away, the slow, quiet creep of a mountain taking the measure of two people who had not taken the measure of it. The feed showed a victory lap. The reality was a countdown, and not one of the hundreds of thousands of people watching could tell the difference. Doing yoga poses on the glacier for the camera, that is the image that stays with me. They were performing strength for an audience while the mountain was already quietly starting to take them apart. Higher up, the mountain stopped flattering them. Above 14,000 feet, the altitude began to bite in a way no amount of marathon training prepares you for, because being able to run for hours at sea level does almost nothing for you in air that holds a fraction of the oxygen your body expects. Altitude does not care about your resting heart rate. It comes for everyone, the elite athlete and the weekend hiker alike, and the only real defense is slow patient acclimatization and the humility to turn around, neither of which was in their toolkit. They grew slower, foggier, and sicker. Lacey started getting blinding headaches and bouts of nausea that she blamed on the food and the dehydration when it was the early edge of altitude sickness. The cold became a living thing that got into their hands and their boots and would not leave, and their fingers, unprotected by the kind of technique experienced climbers use without thinking, started to ache in a way that should have frightened them. What neither of them understood is that altitude does not just exhaust you, it quietly rewires your judgment, dulling the exact part of the brain you need to recognize you are in danger. The sicker they got, the less able they were to see how sick they were, a trap that has killed climbers far more experienced than them. The skills they did not have started to matter more than the fitness they did, because up there the question is not how strong are you, it is, do you know how to move roped together across a glacier? Do you know how to drive an axe into the ice and catch a falling partner? Do you know how to read the sky and know when the weather is about to turn? They did not know any of it, because they had always been able to power through. Denali is the place where powering through runs out. Their whole lives, being tougher than everyone else, had always been enough to win. Up there, it was not enough, and I do not think that they ever really understood that until it was far too late. There is a particular skill that matters more than almost any other on a glacier like Denali, and it is the thing that makes the difference between a bad day and a funeral. When two or more climbers cross a glacier, they tie into a rope at careful intervals, so that if one of them breaks through a hidden snow bridge and drops into a crevasse, the others can throw themselves down, drive their axes and their bodies into the snow, and hold the fall. Then, using a system of knots and pulleys they have practiced until it is automatic, they haul their partner back out. It takes training and repetition and the kind of muscle memory that only comes from doing it over and over in a controlled place before your life depends on it. Guides drill it relentlessly. Real expedition teams practice it until they could do it half asleep, because the one time you need it, you will be exhausted, terrified, freezing, and have only seconds. Cecilia and Lacey had watched videos. They had read about it. They had talked about it the way you talk about a thing you are sure you would just figure out in the moment. They had never once actually done it. Never hung in a harness and hauled a real human weight out of a real hole in the ice. And on Denali, the difference between having watched and having done is the difference between living and dying. They had watched videos of crevasse rescue, but never once done it for real. That gap between watching a thing and being able to do it cold and terrified is the gap I have seen kill people up here. From their highest camp, the night before they pushed for the summit, Cecilia sent one last message out to the people following them. She said the views were unreal, beyond anything words could hold, that they felt strong and clear and ready. She said they were about to do the thing everyone said two women like them could never do, that the hardest part was behind them now, and that the next post would come from the very top of North America, the summit photo, to end all summit photos. She thanked everyone for believing in them. She did not mention that Lacey had been throwing up from the altitude and had barely eaten in a day, or that a storm was building in the forecast they had no real way to read, or that neither of them had slept more than a couple of broken hours in 2 nights. It was the last anyone ever heard from either of them. At their high camp, somewhere above 17,000 feet, they were deep in territory that breaks experienced mountaineers. The cold at that altitude is not the cold of a bad winter day. It is a predator. The kind that takes fingers and toes from people who make a single mistake with a glove or a boot, and both of them were starting to lose feeling in their hands in a way they did not have the experience to take seriously. An experienced climber treats numb fingers as an emergency because frostbite does its damage quietly, and what is numb tonight can be black and dead by morning. Cecilia and Lacey treated it as discomfort, something to push through, the same way they had pushed through every hard workout of their lives. The wind battered their tent through the night. The simple act of melting snow for water took hours and left them gasping. Lacey was barely eating, her body in open revolt against the altitude. And the sensible read of her condition, the read any guide would have made in a heartbeat, was that she was already in trouble and needed to go down, not up. But they had come so far, and the summit was so close, and everything they had told the world and themselves was standing on that top. So they told each other they felt fine. They told each other this was what they had trained for. And in the morning, far later than they should have, they pointed themselves up instead of down. There is one more thing worth saying about the choice they made that morning, and it is not really about mountaineering at all. Every instinct that had built their entire lives was screaming at them to go up. Quitting was not in their vocabulary. Turning back was a thing that happened to other people, and the whole watching world was waiting for a summit photo. Everything that had ever made them successful, the refusal to listen to doubt, the certainty that they could push through anything, the story that fear was just an obstacle to overcome, all of it pointed in exactly the wrong direction on that mountain. The very mindset that had made them who they were was the thing that walked them up that slope. In most of life, that mindset wins, and that is why they trusted it. On Denali, that morning, it was a death sentence, dressed up as courage. They left for the summit far too late in the day, slower than they had planned, both of them moving through the thick fog of serious altitude. A guided team that passed them going down later said they had seemed off, unsteady, oddly cheerful, and slurring in a way that worried the guides, the kind of subtle wrongness that an experienced eye reads instantly as altitude starting to affect the brain. But the guides had their own exhausted clients to get down safely, and no authority over two strangers, and they could not have known these two were entirely alone up there with no team, no guide, and no one tracking them. They assumed, the way everyone did, that anyone this high must have people looking out for them. The smart, experienced choice, the one a ranger or a guide would have forced on them days earlier, was to turn around, to accept that the summit would still be there next year and that the mountain had clearly won this round. But turning around had never been part of how Cecilia and Lacey saw themselves. Their entire brand, their entire sense of who they were, was built on not quitting. So they kept going up, into the cold and the thinning afternoon, toward a summit they had promised the world, and somewhere near the top they ran out of the one thing fitness could never give them, which was margin. The cushion of strength and time and good judgment that lets a climber survive a mistake. They had none left. What gets me is that every experienced person who saw them felt something was wrong. Not one had the standing to stop two strangers, and that is the quiet horror of going alone. They did reach the top, and somewhere up there is the photo they had promised. Two exhausted women on the roof of the continent, smiling into a wind that was already turning against them. The summit shot that was supposed to be the triumphant end of the story. But the summit is only ever the halfway point, and the descent is where Denali does most of its killing, because that is when the body is emptiest and the mind is slowest, and the long accumulated exhaustion finally comes due. On the icy traverse below the summit, the most dangerous stretch of the whole mountain, a hard angled slope of wind-packed ice where a single slip means a fall that does not stop. One of them went down. Whether it was exhaustion, or the altitude finally swamping her judgment, or just a crampon catching wrong on the ice, no one will ever know. But on that slope, unroped or roped without the skill to use it, far beyond the edge of what their bodies had left, a slip was a sentence. They were connected to each other in the worst possible way, tied together with none of the training that lets a roped team catch a fall and save itself, so that the rope, which should have been their lifeline, became the thing that guaranteed they would share the same fate. When one fell, there was no driven axe, no braced body, no practiced anchor. There was only physics. And the mountain took them both. Cecilia Castellano and Lacey Frey never came down off Denali. They died high on the mountain, on the long, brutal descent that kills more climbers than the climb ever does, in a place far above where any easy rescue could reach. And the cruelest part, the part that separates this from so many other mountain tragedies, is how long it took anyone to even start looking, because the two of them had erased themselves from every list that might have raised an alarm. There was no registered return date for a ranger to check against a calendar. There was no guide service radioing in an overdue team. There were no names in the park database, no itinerary on file, no emergency contact a ranger could call when the days stretched on. There were only their followers, scattered across the internet, refreshing their feeds for a summit photo that was never going to come, slowly turning from excited to puzzled to afraid as the silence went on far too long. It was those followers, in the end, and the families behind them, who raised the alarm. Not any official system, because the official system did not know these two women existed on the mountain at all. By the time the worried messages reached the National Park Service, and the rangers made the grim discovery that two unregistered climbers had been up there the whole time, without any of them ever knowing, days had passed, and on Denali days are everything. The difference between a rescue and a recovery. A search eventually pieced together what had happened from the guided team that had seen them near the summit and the route they must have taken down. Their bodies were high on the mountain, in steep, dangerous terrain that made any recovery slow and risky for the rescuers who had to go after them. On the same icy descent that has claimed so many climbers before them, the mountain kept them for a long while, the way it keeps so many, in the cold and the height where the rules they had skipped were written in blood in the first place. Here's what stays with me. Every safeguard that might have saved them was the one they chose to skip. The permit, the orientation, the guide, the friend who begged them. All of it refused. What came down off the mountain instead of Cecilia and Lacey was the feed they left behind. The green smoothies and the sunrise yoga and the captions about strong women refusing to be told what they could not do. A whole archive of confidence that now reads like a slow walk toward an edge. They were not foolish people, and they were not weak, and that is exactly what makes this so hard to sit with. They were strong, truly strong, and they had spent years being told by everyone around them that their strength could carry them through anything, until they carried it to the one place on earth where strength without skill is not an asset but a liability, because it gets you high enough and fast enough to die. If they had been weaker, slower, less sure, they might have turned around at 14,000 feet and lived. Their fitness is the thing that killed them, because it took them past the point where anything could save them. Denali did not care how many marathons they had run, or how many people believed in them, or how empowering the story was going to be. It asked the only question it ever asks, the same question it asks a first-time climber and a seasoned guide, which is whether you respected it enough to learn how to survive it. And the saddest part, the part I cannot stop thinking about, is that the answer was sitting in a ranger station at the bottom of the mountain, in a chair across from a person whose entire job was to save their lives, a room they decided they were too strong to walk into.
It was April 14th, 2016, when a small aircraft landed at Lukla Airport in Nepal, 9,383 feet above sea level. Snow-capped peaks surrounded the valley, and the crisp mountain air hinted at the challenge ahead as the journey to Everest Base Camp began along the rugged Khumbu Valley trails. Among the arriving climbers were Elias Mercer and Zara Kabar. Mercer, 34, a software engineer from Boulder, had spent the last 18 months preparing for this moment, running mountain trails before dawn, carrying weighted packs up Colorado's 14ers, and mentally rehearsing each step toward Everest's summit. Kabar, a biology teacher from Colorado, shared the same focus, her dedication matched by years of high-altitude climbs and meticulous planning. Together, they had conquered peaks across the American West, Rainier, Denali, and Aconcagua for Mercer, Kilimanjaro, Elbrus, and dozens of Colorado 14ers for Kabar. Their combined experience spanned thousands of vertical feet and countless hours in harsh conditions. Yet neither had faced anything approaching the scale or technical demands of Mount Everest. The financial reality had shaped their choice of expedition company. Mercer earned $92,000 annually as a software engineer, while Kaber's teaching salary provided modest savings. Premium expedition companies charge between $65,000 and $85,000 per climber for full-service Everest expeditions. The expedition operator, a Kathmandu-based operator, offered the same summit attempt for $38,000 per person, less than half the industry standard. The company's website featured testimonials from successful 2014 and 2015 climbs. Their lead guide introduced himself as Gauri Sherpa and claimed over a decade of Everest experience with multiple successful summits. According to the expedition's marketing materials, he had guided international climbers safely to the top for years, emphasizing their authentic Sherpa-led approach and intimate group sizes as advantages over larger Western operations. Neither Mercer nor Kaber had verified these credentials with the Nepal Mountaineering Association or cross-referenced the guide's claims with established operators. The trek to Everest Base Camp took 8 days through the Khumbu Valley. Mercer and Kaber acclimatized gradually, sleeping at progressively higher elevations, while their bodies adapted to decreasing oxygen levels. They passed through Namche Bazaar at 11,286 feet, Tengboche Monastery at 12,687 feet, and Dingboche at 14,469 feet. The landscape transformed from green valleys to barren rock and ice as they climbed higher. At Lobouche, their final stop before base camp, Mercer developed a mild cough, a common symptom at altitude as the respiratory system worked harder to extract oxygen from thin air. When he mentioned it to Gauri, the guide provided basic antibiotics, but carried no pulse oximeter to measure blood oxygen saturation, standard equipment for professional high-altitude guides. More concerning, Gauri dismissed the symptom entirely, saying altitude coughs were nothing to worry about, and that Mercer should toughen up. Base camp sprawled across the Khumbu Glacier at 17,600 feet, a temporary city of colorful tents housing over 300 climbers from dozens of expeditions. The expedition operator had established their camp in a relatively isolated section, away from the major commercial operators. The setup was sparse compared to neighboring camps: 2 large mess tents, basic sleeping accommodations, and minimal medical equipment. Mercer and Kaber met their fellow climbers, 4 others from various countries, all drawn by the expedition operator's budget pricing. The total group of 6 clients would be guided by Gauri and 2 Sherpa assistants, a ratio that seemed reasonable until they observed other expeditions and learned that established operators typically employed 1 guide per 2 climbers above Camp 3, where technical difficulties and death risk increased dramatically. The acclimatization process began immediately. Everest's extreme altitude required climbers to ascend and descend repeatedly, allowing their bodies to produce more red blood cells and adapt to oxygen levels that would incapacitate sea level residents within minutes. The standard protocol involved multiple rotations: base camp to Camp 1 and back, then base camp to Camp 2 and back, followed by a push to Camp 3 before returning to base camp for final preparations. In the weeks after arriving at base camp, Mercer and Kaber made their first journey through the Khumbu Icefall, the most technically challenging and objectively dangerous section of the South Col Route. The icefall was a frozen waterfall of house-sized ice blocks, constantly shifting and collapsing as the glacier moved downhill at roughly 3 feet per day. Aluminum ladders spanned deep crevasses, while fixed ropes provided security on near-vertical ice walls. Gauri's behavior during this crucial first rotation raised immediate concerns. Rather than personally guiding his clients through the most dangerous section of the route, he sent Mercer and Kaber into the icefall with one of his assistants while remaining at base camp, claiming he needed to coordinate logistics. When they returned and described a particularly unstable ladder crossing, Gauri laughed and said they were being dramatic. Other expedition leaders they observed personally accompanied their clients through every icefall crossing during acclimatization. Camp 1 sat at 19,900 feet on a relatively flat section of the glacier. During their overnight stay, Kaber noticed that Gauri seemed unfamiliar with basic camp setup procedures, asking his assistants how to properly anchor tents to the ice. When she offered to help based on her mountaineering experience, he became defensive and told her to let the professionals handle it. The pattern of concerning behavior continued over the following weeks. On April 16th, during their push to Camp 2 at 21,300 feet in the western CWM, Gari made several route-finding errors that forced the group to backtrack. The western CWM was a well-established route with clear markers, yet Gari seemed uncertain about the path. When one of his assistants quietly corrected the route, Gari snapped at him in Nepali, creating visible tension within the guiding team. At Camp 2, Mercer's cough persisted, and he noticed pink-tinged sputum when coughing, a potential early warning sign of high-altitude pulmonary edema. When he mentioned this symptom to Gari, the guide's response was dismissive and medically dangerous. He told Mercer that pink sputum was normal, and that real climbers don't complain about every little thing. He provided over-the-counter cough suppressants and refused to discuss descent options or medical monitoring. Kabar began documenting other troubling observations. The oxygen bottles provided by the expedition operator bore Chinese markings with no visible certification stamps, unlike the certified Russian or American systems used by established operators. When she asked Gari about the specifications, he became evasive and claimed they were just as good as the expensive ones. More concerning, she noticed that Gari himself seemed unfamiliar with the oxygen equipment, fumbling with regulators and asking his assistants for help with basic setup procedures. During a rest period at base camp on April 25th, Mercer overheard guides from Madison Mountaineering discussing concerns about unqualified operators endangering clients. One guide mentioned seeing expedition leaders who clearly don't know what they're doing, but were taking clients into the death zone anyway. When Mercer shared this conversation with Kabar, they began paying closer attention to Gari's behavior and competence. Their concerns deepened during the acclimatization rotation to Camp 3 at 24,500 feet. The ascent required climbing the Lhotse face, a steep wall of blue ice rising over 3,000 vertical feet. Gari's rope management was sloppy and potentially dangerous. He failed to properly clip into fixed lines at several points, and had to be reminded by his assistants about basic safety procedures. When Kabar pointed out a missed clip, Gari became angry and accused her of questioning his authority. More alarming was Gari's reaction to Mercer's worsening condition. During the Lhotse face climb, Mercer's breathing became labored and his cough became more frequent. He was clearly struggling beyond normal altitude adjustment, breathing roughly twice the normal rate even at rest. His lips showed a slight blue tinge, and pink-tinged sputum was visible with each coughing episode, classic signs of developing HAPE. When Kabar expressed concern about Mercer's symptoms, Gari's response revealed his medical incompetence. He dismissed the possibility of HAPE entirely, insisting Mercer was simply struggling with the altitude and needed to push through it. He refused to carry a pulse oximeter, stethoscope, or HAPE medications, claiming they were unnecessary equipment that weak climbers use as excuses. His medical kit consisted only of basic first aid supplies and antibiotics. Most disturbing was Gari's reaction when one of his own Sherpa assistants privately suggested that Mercer should descend for medical evaluation. The assistant, who had legitimate high-altitude experience, recognized the severity of Mercer's symptoms. Gari publicly berated the assistant in front of the clients, calling him inexperienced and threatening to send him home without pay. The incident revealed both Gari's medical ignorance and his willingness to silence safety concerns to maintain his authority. As May progressed, weather forecasts indicated a potential summit window for May 19th through 21st. Gari announced that the expedition operator would attempt the summit on May 19th, the same day chosen by most other expeditions on the mountain. When experienced climbers from other teams mentioned the traffic concerns, Gari dismissed them, claiming that crowds are only a problem for slow climbers. His casual attitude toward what other guides considered a serious logistical challenge suggested dangerous overconfidence. The final summit push began on May 14th, when the team moved from base camp to Camp 2. Mercer's condition had deteriorated during their rest period. His cough was persistent. He showed decreased exercise tolerance, and simple tasks left him breathless. Other climbers at Camp 2 quietly expressed concern about his fitness for a summit attempt. But Gari ignored these observations and insisted that Mercer was fine. The ascent to Camp 3 proved particularly revealing of Gari's incompetence. During the 6-hour climb up the Lhotse face, he made multiple route-finding errors, leading the group off the established path twice. His rope work was sloppy, and he had to be corrected by his assistants on basic climbing techniques. When Mercer struggled with the ascent, coughing continuously and showing obvious respiratory distress, Gari told Mercer he was slowing the team down and needed to keep moving. At Camp 3, Mercer's symptoms had progressed to clear HAPE indicators: rapid breathing at rest, blue-tinged lips, productive cough with pink sputum, and signs of confusion. Any competent high-altitude guide would have recognized these symptoms and initiated immediate descent. Instead, Gari insisted that Mercer was just being dramatic, and that supplemental oxygen at Camp 4 would solve all problems. When one of the Sherpa assistants again suggested that Mercer needed medical attention, Gari's reaction was explosive. He accused the assistant of undermining his leadership and threatened to report him to authorities for spreading panic among clients. The assistant, clearly experienced and concerned, backed down rather than risk his livelihood, but his worried glances at Mercer revealed his continued concern. Camp 4, located on the South Col at 26,000 feet, marked entry into the death zone. The team reached the camp in the afternoon, and Mercer was immediately placed on supplemental oxygen. However, Gari's incompetence with the equipment became apparent when he set the flow rate at only 1.5 liters per minute, far below the 2 to 4 liters per minute required for someone showing HAPE symptoms. When Kabar questioned the low flow rate, Gari claimed it was to conserve oxygen, revealing his ignorance of proper medical protocols. During the final summit briefing, Gari's dangerous leadership style became fully apparent. He announced that turnaround times were for quitters and that the team would summit together or not at all. When Mercer asked about individual turnaround decisions based on oxygen supplies or health conditions, Gari became hostile, saying that real mountaineers don't quit and that anyone who turned around would ruin it for everyone else. This approach violated every principle of safe high-altitude guiding. The summit push began under clear skies with temperatures at minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. From the start, Gari's route finding was erratic. He led the group off the established path multiple times, forcing exhausting detours in the thin air. His headlamp technique was poor, and he frequently had to ask his assistants for direction. The delays caused by his navigation errors consumed precious oxygen and energy. Mercer struggled from the beginning. His breathing labored even with supplemental oxygen. They had barely reached the balcony at 27,500 feet, far behind schedule due to Gari's route-finding mistakes. Other expeditions passed them regularly, their guides shaking their heads at the slow progress and obvious disorganization of the expedition operator team. At the balcony, Mercer sat heavily in the snow, unresponsive to questions and showing signs of severe hypoxia and confusion. His breathing was rapid and shallow, clear indicators of advancing HAPE and possible cerebral edema. Any competent guide would have recognized this as a medical emergency requiring immediate descent. Instead, Gari's response was to berate Mercer for holding everyone back and to demand that he stop being weak. Approaching the south summit at 28,700 feet, the team encountered the predicted traffic jam, with over 150 climbers queued on fixed ropes. During the 90-minute wait, Mercer's condition deteriorated rapidly. He was no longer responding coherently to questions, and his oxygen bottle had run empty. When Kabar alerted Gari to the empty bottle, his response revealed the full extent of his negligence. He had brought no spare oxygen bottles and told Kabar to share hers with Mercer. This decision violated every principle of high-altitude safety. Professional guides always carried backup oxygen specifically for such emergencies. Gari's failure to bring spare bottles, combined with his order for Kabar to share her limited supply, put both climbers at immediate risk of death. When Kabar protested that sharing oxygen would endanger them both, Gari accused her of being selfish and threatened to leave them both behind if they didn't follow his orders. Kabar had shared 90 minutes of her oxygen with Mercer, leaving her own reserves critically low. They were still 300 vertical feet below the summit, with Mercer unable to stand without assistance and showing signs of severe altitude sickness. Gari was ahead with other clients, out of radio contact, and apparently unconcerned about the medical emergency developing behind him. The young Sherpa assistant with them spoke limited English, but clearly recognized the severity of the situation. He repeatedly tried to radio Gari for instructions, receiving no response. When he suggested in broken English that they should descend immediately, Kabar realized that even the inexperienced assistant understood the danger better than their supposed expert guide. With Mercer barely conscious and her own oxygen running out, Kabar made the decision to descend. She attempted one final radio call to Gauri, who finally responded with callous indifference, telling her to do whatever she wanted but not to expect him to come back for them. His abandonment of clients in a life-threatening emergency represented the ultimate failure of his guiding responsibilities. The descent became a desperate rescue attempt. Mercer had become dead weight, requiring constant support to prevent falls on the technical terrain. At 28,600 feet, the physical effort of supporting another person quickly exhausted both Kabar and the Sherpa assistant. Mercer's breathing had become irregular, roughly 6 to 8 shallow breaths per minute, indicating his respiratory system was failing. While descending the fixed ropes near the south summit, Mercer collapsed completely. He was no longer breathing effectively, and his skin had taken on a blue-gray color, indicating severe oxygen deprivation. Kabar's own oxygen had already run out, and she was developing hypoxia symptoms herself. The Sherpa assistant tried desperately to drag Mercer, but the effort was impossible at extreme altitude while maintaining safety on the narrow ridge. An Alpine Ascents expedition team eventually reached their position while descending from their own successful summit. The team's lead guide, a veteran with 8 Everest summits, immediately assessed the situation. Mercer was unconscious with blue lips and fingernails, showing no palpable pulse, clear signs of cardiac arrest brought on by severe altitude illness. The experienced guide recognized that Mercer had progressed beyond the point where field treatment could help. At 28,600 feet, cardiopulmonary resuscitation was impossible due to the thin air and technical terrain. He gave Kabar emergency oxygen from his team's supplies and made the difficult assessment that Mercer was beyond help. When Kabar, suffering from hypothermia and severe hypoxia, refused to leave Mercer's body, the guide made the decision to physically separate her and escort her to safety. Mercer's body remained on the slope, 15 feet from the fixed line marking the standard route. At extreme altitude, body recovery was extraordinarily dangerous, and the location made immediate attempts too risky for rescue teams. Kabar reached Camp 4 in critical condition, severely frostbitten on 3 fingers and both feet. She was placed on high-flow oxygen and wrapped in insulated sleeping bags. Gauri arrived later, having successfully summited with his other clients. His reaction to Mercer's death was shockingly callous. He showed no remorse and told Kabar that people die on mountains and that Mercer had simply been too weak for Everest anyway. Weather conditions allowed for a rare helicopter evacuation from Camp 4. Kabar was flown to Kathmandu for emergency medical treatment, likely saving her life as her frostbite injuries required immediate specialized care. 3 days later, descending climbers spotted Mercer's body partially buried in snow. The dangerous location prevented immediate recovery attempts, and his family was notified of the circumstances surrounding his death. Nepalese authorities launched an investigation into the expedition operator following the tragedy. The investigation revealed the shocking truth about Gauri Sherpa's credentials. He had never been a certified mountain guide and had falsified virtually every claim on the company's website. Rather than over a decade of Everest experience, he had worked as a porter on only 2 previous expeditions and had never climbed above Camp 2. He had never summited Everest or any major peak, and had no formal training in high-altitude medicine or rescue techniques. The investigation further revealed that Gauri Sherpa was not even his real name. He had adopted the identity to appear more credible to Western clients. His actual background was in Kathmandu's tourism industry, where he had worked as a hotel clerk before deciding that guiding offered better financial opportunities. He had created the expedition operator as a shell company, using forged documents and fake testimonials to attract budget-conscious climbers. The oxygen bottles provided by the expedition operator were counterfeit Chinese models containing approximately 30% less oxygen than labeled. Gauri had purchased them from an unauthorized supplier in Kathmandu's black market, choosing the cheapest option available regardless of safety implications. The reduced oxygen content meant climbers received inadequate breathing gas during critical phases of the ascent, directly contributing to Mercer's deterioration and death. The expedition operator had operated through a corrupt liaison officer who rubber-stamped permit applications without proper vetting in exchange for bribes. The company had no legitimate safety record because it had never operated legally. All previous successful expeditions mentioned in testimonials were fabricated. The regulatory system's reliance on self-reporting and voluntary compliance had allowed a completely unqualified individual to lead paying clients into the death zone. Kabar underwent multiple surgeries but ultimately lost 2 toes and the tips of 3 fingers to frostbite. She filed a lawsuit against the expedition operator, but the company dissolved immediately after Mercer's death, and Gauri disappeared into Kathmandu's underground economy. Nepalese courts provided no effective recourse for foreign climbers seeking damages from fraudulent operators. Mercer's body was finally retrieved in 2018 during a recovery expedition funded by his family. The autopsy confirmed death from high-altitude pulmonary edema, progressing to cardiac arrest, compounded by severe hypoxia from inadequate oxygen supply and complete lack of proper medical care. His lungs contained over 500 milliliters of fluid, clear evidence of advanced HAPE that any qualified guide would have recognized and treated immediately. The coroner's report concluded that with proper oxygen equipment, immediate descent at the first signs of HAPE, and competent medical decision-making by a qualified guide, Mercer's death was entirely preventable.
It was May 3rd, 2017. At Tribhuvan International Airport in Kathmandu, Nepal, 3 American fitness influencers arrived to begin a sponsored Mount Everest expedition. First was Maeve Kaler. She was 28, from Denver, Colorado. She worked as a personal trainer and had done some amateur bodybuilding competitions in her early 20s, the kind that barely got any attention outside local circles. Over time, she picked up a modest online following, nothing viral, just steady growth from training clips and client transformations. About 183,000 on Instagram and just under 100,000 on YouTube. Enough to make a living, not enough to make her a household name. What she was really known for, though, wasn't aesthetics or hype. It was her belief that with the right training and recovery, you could compress time. In her view, most people just trained inefficiently, and she felt she'd already proven that. In 2016, she climbed Mount Rainier. A year later, she went to Argentina for Aconcagua. Most people take about 21 days for that climb. She did it in 17. I understand exactly how she got here. Aconcagua rewarded her for pushing the timeline, and nothing on that mountain told her she'd been wrong to do it. She filmed the whole thing, turned it into a series, and it ended up being her biggest success. That experience changed things for her. It reinforced the idea that with enough preparation, you didn't need traditional timelines. So when Everest came up, she didn't just join the project, she built it. She brought in sponsors, recruited the team, and shaped the expedition around one goal. After weeks of pre-acclimatization at home and a short stay at base camp, they would complete the mountain's climbing phase in just 7 days. If it worked, it would validate everything she'd been saying for years. They weren't ordinary clients trying to shortcut Everest. Physically, they were among the strongest people on the mountain. That was the paradox. Their conditioning allowed them to keep climbing long after a less fit person would have turned around. The Sherpas weren't questioning whether the women were strong enough to keep climbing. They were worried that their strength would let them push well past the point where acclimatization had already begun falling behind. Then there was Oriana Dralin, 31, from Austin, Texas. She came from CrossFit regional level, not elite, but built a strong audience anyway, around 241,000 followers, by focusing on recovery, breathwork, and performance. On this climb, she handled the performance side, supplements, biometrics, recovery planning. It was the biggest sponsorship of her career, but her altitude experience was limited. Before Nepal, the highest she'd ever been was Mount Whitney at 14,505 feet. My brain just cannot square 14,000 feet as preparation for where she was headed. The third was Kira Orsley, 26, from Scottsdale, Arizona. She came from collegiate swimming, then moved into endurance coaching and sports nutrition. Her following was smaller, about 118,000, but highly engaged. That engagement is what got her picked by a Scottsdale nutrition company running the Everest campaign. In the 6 weeks before the trip, she slept every night in a hypoxic tent, simulating about 14,000 feet. She documented everything. The company sold it as proof that pre-acclimatization plus their nutrition system could replace the usual 8 to 12 day approach trek to base camp. I keep thinking about the gap between 14,000 feet in a tent and 29,000 feet on that ridge, and how confidently that gap marketed as closed. Kira believed in it. For her, this wasn't just another sponsorship. It was the biggest opportunity she'd ever had. All three women had signed sponsorship agreements that included a summit completion bonus tied to the expedition's accelerated 7-day climbing schedule. A licensed Kathmandu expedition operator provided permits, logistics, Sherpa support, oxygen, and an expedition physician whose authority remained advisory rather than absolute. The team planned to climb Everest by the South Col route, ascending from base camp at 17,600 feet through camps 1-2, and IV before the final push to the 29,032-foot summit. As the route climbs higher, atmospheric pressure steadily falls, leaving fewer oxygen molecules available with every breath. Physical fitness can improve how efficiently the body uses oxygen, but it cannot replace oxygen that is no longer there. In fact, exceptional fitness can sometimes become deceptive on Everest. A strong cardiovascular system allows climbers to keep moving despite worsening oxygen deprivation, masking problems that would force others to stop much earlier. The body continues climbing while the brain and lungs quietly fall behind. Survival at extreme altitude depends on acclimatization, a gradual process in which the body responds to reduced oxygen by producing additional red blood cells. Meaningful adaptation requires days, while the level needed to function safely above 26,000 feet typically develops only after weeks of progressive exposure. Traditional Everest expeditions therefore last 40 to 60 days, and even accelerated commercial climbs usually require at least 3 weeks. Although the expedition's climbing phase was planned around 7 active climbing days, the team believed weeks of pre-acclimatization completed before arriving in Nepal would compensate for the shortened schedule. The Sherpas had guided enough Everest expeditions to recognize when acclimatization wasn't progressing normally. The women looked exceptionally fit, and nobody questioned whether they could physically climb the mountain. What concerned several of the Sherpas was how slowly their bodies appeared to be adapting. Experience had taught them that fitness and acclimatization were not the same thing. 7 active climbing days, that was the schedule. And on Everest, that's not much time for the body to adjust. The Sherpas did voice their concerns. They recommended slowing the schedule and giving the team more time to acclimatize, but recommendations weren't decisions. The expedition had already been planned, the weather window was approaching, and the final choice remained with the clients and expedition leadership. Once it became clear the schedule wasn't changing, the Sherpas shifted their focus to keeping the climb as safe as they could. The hypoxic tents likely provided some physiological benefit by simulating an altitude of roughly 14,000 feet, but they could not reproduce the prolonged exposure required higher on the mountain. Supplemental oxygen reduced the strain of extreme altitude, yet it could not replace an acclimatization process that still depended largely on time. That assumption sat at the center of the expedition. The women believed careful training and pre-acclimatization could safely shorten the traditional schedule, while high-altitude medicine regarded adaptation as a process governed primarily by time. The climb took place during the spring 2017 pre-monsoon summit window, with favorable conditions forecast between May 10th and May 12th. The expedition itself was well supported, with 4 experienced Sherpas, an expedition physician carrying dexamethasone, acetazolamide, a portable hyperbaric chamber, continuous pulse oximetry equipment, satellite communications, and a fully equipped base camp. Rather than trekking in from Lukla like most expeditions, the team flew directly to base camp by helicopter. The shortcut eliminated several days of gradual altitude gain that traditionally contribute to acclimatization, although the expedition believed weeks of pre-acclimatization at home would largely compensate. The physician scheduled several days of observation before the first climbing rotation. Initial oxygen saturation measurements were lower than expected after such a rapid ascent to base camp, particularly Oriana's. The physician wasn't alarmed by a single day's results and expected them to improve with rest, hydration, and acetazolamide. The Sherpa team leader quietly recorded each reading in a notebook, more interested in whether the trend would improve over the coming days than the numbers themselves. That notebook is what gets me. He's not alarmed, he's not arguing, he's just writing down exactly what the numbers already are. Next day, they settled in. They're filming content, doing sponsor stuff, trying to keep things normal. At the same time, they're dealing with the usual early altitude issues, headaches, low appetite, that kind of thing. Pretty standard up there. The doctor starts them on Diamox to help with acclimatization, while the Sherpas get everything ready for the climb ahead. But by the next evening, the numbers, they're barely moving. Maeve is up slightly, around 80%. Kira, too, just a small bump to 78%. And Oriana is still sitting low at 73%. Even after rest, fluids, meds, everything she's doing on her side. 73% after rest, after medication. That number should have stopped everything right there. And I don't know how it didn't. Like it usually does. But the Sherpa leader isn't really reassured. He's seen this before. When oxygen levels don't start coming up in those first days at base camp, it usually doesn't end well on the higher slopes. On May 6th, the team completed its first acclimatization rotation through the Khumbu Icefall to Camp 1 at 19,900 feet. They moved through the shifting maze of seracs, crevasses, and fixed ladders faster than any comparable commercial clients the Sherpas had guided that season. Their fitness was undeniable, but as the Sherpas watched them recover, they saw a familiar pattern. Fitness could reduce fatigue. It could not reduce the effects of altitude. At Camp 1, the team's oxygen saturation readings fell below what would normally be expected after a rotation ascent. Well-acclimatized climbers typically recover into the mid-70s or low 80s after resting. Maeve recorded 68%, Kira 71%, and Oriana 63%. 63% after rest, and they're still on the schedule. I genuinely have to stop and sit with that for a second. The physician administered brief supplemental oxygen before the group descended to base camp as planned. Their evening readings improved after returning to 17,600 feet, but the Sherpa team leader quietly began keeping a handwritten log of the team's oxygen saturation at every elevation. On May 7th, the team started their second push toward Camp 2 at about 21,300 feet. The original plan was to keep going all the way to Camp 3, but things changed pretty quickly. Overnight, Oriana developed this persistent dry cough. And yeah, coughing like that isn't unusual in Everest's cold, dry air. But it can also be one of the earliest signs of high-altitude pulmonary edema. The doctor couldn't say for certain what was causing it yet, so he decided to stop the climb at Camp 2 instead. Safer that way. The women agreed, and publicly framed it as a cautious adjustment rather than a setback. Even after resting at Camp 2 with supplemental oxygen, though, all three recovered more slowly than expected. Oriana continued showing the poorest oxygenation, while Maeve and Kira also remained below what the physician expected to see. At that point, it wasn't any single reading that concerned him anymore. It was the pattern. I find it genuinely hard to watch a medical warning sign get repackaged as good decision-making for the camera. On camera, though, they still looked composed. Sitting in their tents, talking normally, filming content, all of that. But the medical side of things told a very different story. After finishing the rotation, they dropped back down to base camp again. That evening, the Sherpa team leader went over all the readings from both climbs. And what stood out wasn't just that the numbers were low, it was the pattern. I read a comment on a previous Everest video that stuck with me. I pointed out how the same drive that builds a climber's career can also put them at risk up here. I really appreciate that perspective. It's something that I wouldn't always catch on my own. Instead of improving with exposure like you'd expect, their oxygen levels were actually dropping at higher altitude. And even when they came back down, recovery was slow. Slower than it should have been. He'd guided enough Everest expeditions to recognize what that usually means. The body just isn't acclimatizing the way it should. And interestingly, the expedition doctor was starting to think the same thing too. After reviewing the team's recovery following 2 acclimatization rotations, the physician recommended postponing the summit attempt until their oxygenation showed clearer improvement. He warned that continuing according to the original schedule significantly increased the risk of serious altitude illness. The women accepted only a 1-day delay, arguing that further postponement would cause them to miss the projected summit window. The doctor asked for 2 days and they gave him 1. And I keep coming back to the fact that he had no authority to make it stick. Lacking authority to overrule them, the physician documented both his recommendation and their decision. The Sherpa team leader quietly established his own benchmarks that evening. If any climber developed clear neurological changes, worsening breathing, or failed to maintain acceptable oxygenation despite supplemental oxygen, he intended to end the climb immediately. The following day, the team climbed to Camp 3 at 24,500 feet via the Khumbu Icefall, Camp 2, and the Lhotse face. Their pace remained exceptionally strong, but their physiology continued moving in the opposite direction. Concerned by the previous rotations, the physicians started supplemental oxygen above 23,000 feet earlier than planned. Oriana's cough had worsened, and her breathing remained labored despite the increased flow. At Camp 3, even while receiving supplemental oxygen, Oriana continued showing unusually poor oxygenation and increasing respiratory distress. Pulse oximeter readings became less reliable at that altitude, but her labored breathing, worsening cough, and slow recovery were difficult to ignore. I look at that number and I don't see data anymore. I see her lungs struggling to do their job, even with direct help. The Sherpa team leader reached the same conclusion and privately resolved that if her oxygen saturation dropped below 70% or she showed clear neurological or respiratory decline, the climb would end immediately, regardless of her wishes. The team spent the night at Camp 3, where Oriana's oxygen saturation repeatedly fell below 70% whenever her oxygen flow was reduced, forcing the physician to increase it throughout the night. By the morning of May 10th, the team left Camp 3 and began the climb toward Camp 4. The route crossed the upper Lhotse face before reaching the Geneva Spur, a steep band of exposed rock where climbers leave the ice briefly to scramble upward on fixed ropes. Beyond it lay the South Col, a broad, windswept saddle between Everest and Lhotse at 26,300 feet. It is one of the harshest camps on Earth, where decades of expeditions have left behind empty oxygen cylinders, torn tents, and broken equipment scattered across the frozen plateau by relentless wind. The three women made it to Camp 4 early that afternoon, and up there, it's brutal. The temperature was sitting around negative 31 degrees Fahrenheit with strong winds just cutting straight across the South Col. Like before, they were all on supplemental oxygen the whole time. No exceptions at that height. Because of Oriana's worsening condition, the physician administered dexamethasone in case cerebral edema was also beginning to develop while continuing high-flow oxygen for her worsening respiratory symptoms. But Oriana, she never really managed to rest. That cough she'd had earlier, the dry one, it had changed. By evening, it wasn't dry anymore. It was deeper, wetter, and honestly hard to ignore even outside her tent. My stomach dropped at that detail. A cough that goes from dry to wet at that altitude is not the same thing anymore. Around 9 at night, it was actually loud enough that one of the nearby Sherpas heard it from his own tent. He went straight to the team leader and reported it. The leader came in to check on her himself. Oriana insisted she was fine, that she could still go on. She didn't want to stop there, but the doctor was clearly concerned. That kind of cough at that altitude, it can mean fluid building up in the lungs. He wrote it down in his notes, didn't ignore it. Still, the climb wasn't stopped, and by 11:30 that night, headlamps were turning on all across the South Col. Everyone clipped into the fixed ropes, getting ready for the final push toward the summit. Late on the evening of May 10th, shortly before midnight, the summit team left Camp 4 under clear skies. Temperatures hovered around negative 31 degrees Fahrenheit, and although strong winds swept across the ridge, conditions were considered favorable for a summit attempt. Within the first hour, Oriana began falling behind, stopping every few steps despite her Sherpa's encouragement. By the time they reached the balcony at 27,600 feet, her lips had turned bluish-gray beneath her oxygen mask, and each breath produced a wet, gurgling sound. A little after 3 that morning, the team leader ended her summit attempt, radioed Camp 4, and assigned the most experienced Sherpa to begin descending with her while the rest of the team continued upward. Nothing about the weather would later explain what happened. At first, Oriana could still walk with assistance, but her condition deteriorated quickly. She followed some instructions and ignored others, at one point removing her oxygen mask without explanation until her Sherpa forced it back over her face. I need to be honest, when I read that she removed the mask without knowing why, that's not fighting the summit anymore. Her brain is already in serious trouble. As they descended below the balcony, he was no longer simply guiding her. He was supporting much of her weight with every step. Farther up the mountain, the summit push was unraveling. Above the balcony, Maeve gradually became quieter. She answered questions after noticeable delays and twice stepped away from the established track before her Sherpa redirected her. As the climb continued, her pace slowed until she finally sat down beside the fixed rope. When her Sherpa urged her to stand, she looked at him without any clear sign of recognition. Soon afterwards, she removed her oxygen mask despite repeated instructions to leave it in place, then began making small, repetitive movements with her hands against her suit. I can't shake the image of her sitting there, eyes open, hands moving against her suit, completely unreachable, at 28 28,000 feet. The Sherpa had seen the signs before: confusion, disorientation, removing oxygen equipment without understanding why, and the loss of purposeful movement were classic signs of high-altitude cerebral edema. He radioed the team leader immediately. Higher on the ridge, less than 300 feet below the summit, Kira suddenly asked her Sherpa what country they were in. Minutes later, she asked the same question again. During the descent, she repeatedly unclipped one hand from the fixed rope without realizing it, stopped walking for no apparent reason, and required constant verbal prompting to continue. By the time she reached Camp 4, she no longer recognized several members of the expedition team. Below them, Maeve was getting worse fast. Eventually, she just collapsed against the fixed rope and couldn't keep herself upright anymore. In temperatures around negative 38 degrees Fahrenheit, with strong winds sweeping across the ridge, there wasn't an easy way to move someone in that condition. Her Sherpa tried, but he couldn't manage it alone. After securing Kira to the fixed rope, her Sherpa descended to help. Together, they gave Maeve an emergency injection of dexamethasone for suspected high-altitude cerebral edema before beginning the descent. One Sherpa stayed below her while the other supported most of her weight from behind. Progress was painfully slow. On terrain that steep and exposed, every few steps demanded time, strength, and oxygen they couldn't afford to lose. Partway down the triangular face, Maeve's oxygen cylinder ran empty. Replacing it meant briefly removing insulated gloves to connect a new bottle, a delicate task made far more difficult by the cold and the altitude. I think about those Sherpas, bare hands, negative 38 degrees, a barely conscious woman, and I don't know how they stay composed in conditions like that. For several minutes, she was forced to breathe the thin ambient air of nearly 28,500 feet. Before the new cylinder was fully connected, her breathing began to change. Each breath grew slower and deeper, separated by increasingly long pauses. Even after oxygen flow was restored, the pattern did not improve. Not long afterward, Maeve lost consciousness. Her breathing deteriorated into slow, irregular gasps, separated by extended periods of silence. One Sherpa remained at her side, keeping her secured to the fixed rope while supporting her airway, as the other radioed Camp 4 and described her condition to the expedition physician in detail. Unable to reach their position, the physician assessed the situation from the information being relayed. His conclusion confirmed what both Sherpas already understood. High on the triangular face, thousands of feet above Camp 4, the physician listened as the Sherpas described Maeve's condition over the radio. Based on their report, he concluded that further resuscitation was no longer possible. Unable to recover her safely, the Sherpas secured her to the fixed rope before continuing the descent. Back at Camp 4, Oriana arrived unconscious. The physician immediately placed her inside the expedition's Gammo bag, a portable hyperbaric chamber designed to simulate a lower altitude by increasing air pressure. Despite high-flow oxygen, her oxygen saturation remained critically low. For the next several hours, the physician alternated between pressurizing the chamber, administering dexamethasone, and monitoring her condition. The treatment slowed her deterioration, but it did not reverse it. Over the following morning, several Sherpas coordinated the difficult descent to Camp 2, taking turns supporting and lowering Oriana across the steep terrain. From there, a helicopter, the highest evacuation point possible under the conditions, transported her to a hospital in Kathmandu. Kira descended separately with her assigned Sherpa, requiring increasing physical assistance as the descent continued. By the time she reached base camp, she remained awake but could answer only simple questions and frequently failed to recognize people she had been speaking with earlier in the day. Despite high-flow oxygen and emergency treatment, her neurological condition continued to worsen overnight. The expedition operator submitted its incident report to Nepalese authorities days later, including the physician's medical logs, oxygen saturation records, and radio communications from the summit push. After review, investigators concluded that the expedition had complied with applicable regulations, and no action was taken against either the operator or the expedition physician. Investigators concluded that Maeve Kaylor died on the upper southeast ridge from high-altitude cerebral edema. Oriana Draylen died in a Kathmandu hospital after evacuation, where progressive high-altitude pulmonary edema led to irreversible respiratory failure despite intensive treatment. Kira Orsley survived the descent but developed worsening cerebral edema that continued progressing after evacuation. Despite mechanical ventilation, dexamethasone, hyperosmolar therapy, and intensive care, she died several days later from irreversible brain swelling. I said she survived, and now I'm sitting here with what actually happened. The investigation concluded that the 3 women had succumbed to different manifestations of altitude illness, but all shared the same underlying cause. Their bodies had not completed the acclimatization required for prolonged exposure above 26,000 feet. Their fitness allowed them to climb faster than most clients. It could not allow them to adapt faster than human physiology. Within days of the incident, the supplement company suspended the campaign, and more than 40 hours of expedition footage was never released publicly. The operator continued guiding future expeditions while the sponsors quietly withdrew from the project.
It was April 3rd, 2016, at approximately 17,600 feet on the Khumbu Glacier below Mount Everest. The air was thin, temperatures hovered below freezing, and intermittent gusts pushed fine ice across the uneven moraine surrounding base camp. Calder Vance, 52, was a private equity founder from Greenwich who built his wealth through high-value acquisitions and short-cycle ventures, treating challenges as investments rather than skills to develop over time. With no technical climbing background and only a recent guided ascent of Kilimanjaro, he joined the expedition with premium gear, private Sherpa support, and a compressed timeline of just over 2 weeks from arrival in Kathmandu to summit attempt. Assuming resources could offset inexperience despite documented reservations from the outfitter, he arrived in Kathmandu 4 days earlier on a private charter, carrying 2 pieces of luggage heavier than what most climbers bring for a full expedition. His equipment, custom boots, high-altitude down suit, and a redundant oxygen system was selected through paid consultations with a Colorado outfitter, prioritizing technical specifications over practical familiarity, with total costs exceeding several years of a guide's income. The expedition package provided extensive support, including a lead Sherpa, 2 additional Sherpas, satellite communication, prioritized fixed-line access, and remote medical consultation. Even with these provisions, the shortened schedule conflicted with standard acclimatization practices, which typically require 4 to 5 weeks. At elevations from 17,600 feet at base camp to above 29,000 feet on Mount Everest, the body's need to gradually adapt to reduced oxygen cannot be accelerated, increasing risk with each gain in altitude. Vance had completed 2 high-altitude trekking simulations in the 18 months before the expedition, a guided hike in Colorado reaching approximately 14,200 feet, and a 2-day trek in Peru reaching 15,400 feet before descending. He had also used a hypoxic training tent at his home in Greenwich for 6 weeks, sleeping at simulated altitudes between 10,000 and 14,000 feet. These preparations provided limited exposure, but did not match the demands of sustained climbing above 20,000 feet, a gap that was more apparent to the team around him than to Vance himself. That last part, read it again. His lead Sherpa, an experienced guide with over a dozen Everest summits, recognized early behavioral patterns that indicated resistance to guidance. In the days after arrival at base camp on Mount Everest, Vance focused on operational details such as oxygen flow rates, timing, and route logistics, while showing less engagement with recommendations involving delay or additional acclimatization. When advised to complete an extra rotation before entering the Khumbu icefall, he evaluated the impact on schedule rather than the safety rationale. The adjustment would have added approximately 3 days, and he chose to proceed without it. From what I found researching this, that 3-day decision is where most guides privately mark the point of no return. The Khumbu icefall is the first major obstacle on the southern route of Mount Everest, spanning roughly 2 miles of constantly shifting terrain between base camp and Camp 1. The glacier moves several feet per day, forming unstable ice towers, crevasses, and seracs that can change within hours. Each season, Sherpas known as icefall doctors establish the route using ladders and fixed ropes, but conditions remain unpredictable, with sections that are stable in the morning becoming compromised later in the day. Vance began his first rotation through the icefall on April 5th, departing base camp at 3:45 a.m. with his lead Sherpa and 1 support Sherpa. The temperature was approximately -8 degrees Fahrenheit, with light wind and clear skies. Early movement was standard to take advantage of colder, more stable ice and lighter traffic. Within the first hour, his movement over the terrain was observed to be inefficient. He applied excessive force with each step, creating minor instabilities on uneven ice, and required repeated correction on crampon placement. During 2 ladder crossings over crevasses, he paused mid-crossing to adjust his footing, indicating limited familiarity with crampons on metal rungs. Although both crossings were completed without incident, they took longer than expected, increasing exposure time in a section where stability is limited and conditions can shift without warning. Every extra minute in the icefall is a minute the mountain gets to decide something for you, and that's not dramatic. That's just physics. By the time the team reached the upper section of the icefall, at approximately 19,500 feet on Mount Everest, Vance's breathing rate had increased beyond what exertion alone would explain, with short, rapid breaths and frequent pauses. He reported a persistent headache, attributing it to dehydration and fatigue, and continued after drinking water. The lead Sherpa noted the symptom without escalation, recognizing it as an early but common indicator of altitude strain. The team reached Camp 1 at approximately 19,900 feet, rested briefly, and descended the same day. On the return through the icefall, Vance's fatigue affected his precision, and he required a reminder to remain properly clipped to the fixed line on a steeper section. He returned to base camp in the afternoon, recovered for several hours, and reported feeling improved, shifting focus to the next rotation. Feeling better at base camp after a rough rotation is almost universal up there. It doesn't mean the problem went away. A 2-day rest period was recommended to allow for recovery and acclimatization, but Vance questioned the delay and pushed for a shorter interval. The schedule was adjusted, and the team rested for 1 day before continuing. 1 day instead of 2. Stay with me, because this keeps happening. The second rotation began on April 8th, taking the team through the icefall and into the western Siwim en route to Camp 2 at approximately 21,300 feet on Mount Everest. The terrain in the Siwim was less technical than the icefall, with fewer ladder crossings and more gradual elevation gain, but the altitude remained significant and continuous. The relative ease of movement reduced immediate physical strain while allowing hypoxia-related effects to develop with less obvious resistance. Vance reached Camp 2 on the afternoon of April 9th after spending the previous night at Camp 1. Arriving later than planned due to a slower pace across the Siwim. Afternoon winds at camp were gusting between 30 and 38 miles per hour, increasing the effort required for routine tasks such as setting up gear and preparing food. His movements were noticeably slower than at base camp, and he consumed only a partial meal, reporting reduced appetite. That night, his sleep was disrupted beyond typical high-altitude patterns. He woke multiple times, and during one instance appeared briefly disoriented regarding location and time before regaining awareness. He attributed it to a dream and did not report it as a symptom, but the observation was noted by the Sherpa team. When I came across this detail in the expedition records, I had to stop. The Sherpas are watching him deteriorate in real time while he's explaining it away as a bad dream. Disorientation during sleep at altitude is an early indicator that altitude sickness may be progressing beyond mild, manageable levels. It can reflect reduced oxygen delivery to the brain during sleep, when supplemental oxygen is often reduced or not actively monitored. In experienced climbers, this symptom can prompt reassessment and consideration of an additional acclimatization cycle. In Vance's case, after already declining an extra rotation and compressing the schedule, it was instead noted and monitored more closely by the support team. The team descended to base camp on April 10th on Mount Everest, where Vance remained for 3 days before the next rotation, longer than he preferred, but shorter than what the lead Sherpa advised. During this period, he maintained contact with his office in Greenwich via satellite communication, reviewed weather updates, and interacted with other climbers at base camp. He presented himself as confident and decisive, speaking about the summit attempt as an inevitable outcome already in motion rather than a question still being evaluated. Base camp at that time included a mix of experienced climbers and guided clients at different stages of acclimatization, some preparing for summit bids and others recovering from altitude-related setbacks. Within this environment, Vance was seen as a well-resourced but relatively inexperienced entrant whose confidence exceeded his exposure. Among the Sherpas and guides observing him, the key concern was not motivation, but physiological readiness, as performance at extreme altitude depends less on intent and more more on the body's ability to adapt to sustained low oxygen conditions, which cannot be accelerated by planning or resolve alone. If you've watched other videos on this channel, you know this is the exact pattern I keep coming back to. The mountain doesn't negotiate with your schedule. The third rotation began on April 14th and was intended to carry the team to Camp 3 at approximately 23,500 feet on the Lhotse face of Mount Everest. This section of the route is significantly more technical than lower elevations, requiring sustained crampon precision, continuous use of fixed lines, and controlled movement on steep blue ice where small errors accumulate quickly under fatigue and low oxygen conditions. Vance began using supplemental oxygen at Camp 2 before the ascent, earlier than standard practice for most climbers on the route. He also increased the flow rate beyond what the lead Sherpa recommended for ascent, improving immediate comfort but accelerating oxygen consumption and increasing logistical pressure for later stages. The Sherpa did not challenge the adjustment, instead recalibrating supply distribution among the team to ensure continuity through Camp 3. The ascent proceeded in stable weather conditions, with winds reaching approximately 35 miles per hour on upper sections of the face but not sustained enough to halt progress. However, Vance's pace was inconsistent, alternating between brief periods of faster movement and extended pauses while clipped into fixed lines. These pauses gradually lengthened, suggesting increasing physiological strain rather than simple rest. At approximately 22,800 feet, during one of these pauses, he removed his outer gloves to adjust equipment on his harness, exposing his hands to temperatures near minus 12 degrees Fahrenheit with significantly lower wind chill adjusted values. The adjustment took several minutes, extending cold exposure beyond what is considered safe for maintaining fine motor control. The lead Sherpa observed that this was part of a repeated pattern of glove removal during technical sections across previous rotations, each instance increasing cumulative risk to dexterity and circulation. Repeated pattern. That's the part that sits heavy with me. Vance eventually replaced his gloves and continued the ascent toward Camp 3. They reached Camp 3 in the afternoon on Mount Everest, later than typically planned for that elevation. At approximately 23,500 feet on the Lhotse face, the camp sat on a narrow, steep ice shelf where tents had to be carefully leveled, just enough to prevent sliding. The environment offered no real comfort, only reduced exposure, and every basic action, from eating to sleeping, required deliberate effort under severe oxygen limitation and cold. Vance's condition at Camp 3 was the most concerning the lead Sherpa had observed so far. His coordination showed subtle but consistent decline, visible in small inaccuracies such as reaching past objects and needing repeated adjustments to his oxygen mask. While he remained communicative and able to perform basic tasks, his self-assessment appeared increasingly unreliable. Honestly, that phrase, self-assessment appeared increasingly unreliable, is one of the most quietly devastating things I read in this entire case, because he had no idea. That night, the lead Sherpa monitored his breathing and noted irregular periodic patterns, with alternating pauses and rapid recovery breaths. Although not uncommon at altitude, the frequency combined with prior symptoms at Camp 2 raised concern. In a brief discussion before Vance awoke fully, the Sherpa team agreed that descent was the appropriate recommendation before any further ascent. Based on prior interactions, they also anticipated that the recommendation would not be accepted. When Vance was presented with the recommendation to descend, he listened without interruption and asked whether the observed symptoms were medically disqualifying or precautionary. The lead Sherpa clarified that they were cautionary, but serious indicators of worsening altitude response. Vance acknowledged the assessment, but stated that the expedition's cost, limited weather window, and his fixed schedule made descent an option he was not willing to take at that stage. Believe me, I've tried to find a version of that sentence that doesn't end badly. There isn't one. He requested the next 48-hour forecast for Mount Everest. The outlook showed a workable but non-ideal window, with winds between 25 and 40 miles per hour and stable temperatures for the season without significant precipitation. Based on this, he chose to continue and requested movement toward Camp 4 the following morning. The lead Sherpa agreed to proceed, continuing because abandoning him on the route could create even greater immediate danger. While guides can advise against unsafe continuation and document concerns, they cannot physically prevent a climber from moving upward. In this case, the Sherpa team remained in close support, monitoring for further physiological decline as the climb progressed. Preparations for the push toward Camp 4 began that afternoon on Mount Everest. oxygen canisters were inventoried and redistributed, and all critical climbing equipment was inspected. The lead Sherpa checked Vance's harness, crampon attachments, and ascender, finding them serviceable. During the inspection, he observed early signs of cold stress in Vance's fingertips. Pale, waxy skin, consistent with repeated exposure to sub-freezing conditions. That's frostbite staging. Not a warning sign anymore, a finding. Vance acknowledged the observation, but reported normal sensation and continued preparation. That night at Camp 3, temperatures dropped below -20 degrees Fahrenheit, with sustained wind against the tents, making sleep fragmented even for experienced climbers. Vance's oxygen delivery was set for rest support, but on 2 separate checks during the night, the mask had shifted slightly, reducing efficiency. The Sherpa corrected the placement each time without waking him. By morning, Vance was awake and preparing for ascent. He completed basic tasks, eating, hydrating, and assembling gear, at a slower pace than earlier rotations. The lead Sherpa noted a continued increase in time required for routine equipment checks, consistent with cumulative fatigue and prolonged exposure above 17,000 feet. The team departed Camp 3 in the early morning before full daylight, beginning the ascent onto the Lhasa face toward Camp 4. The Lhasa face above Camp 3 on Mount Everest presents sustained steep ice where fixed-line movement demands constant precision. There are no natural rest points, and the exposure is continuous, with any lapse in technique translating immediately into significant fall risk due to the uninterrupted angle of descent below the route. The team ascended in standard formation, with the lead Sherpa guiding the line, Vance positioned in the middle, and supporting Sherpas behind. From the start, his pace was slow and increasingly dependent on upper body effort rather than leg-driven crampon movement, indicating growing fatigue. Despite repeated corrections from the lead Sherpa, his technique reverted within minutes, requiring ongoing supervision rather than correction alone. At approximately 24,200 feet, Vance took an extended rest while clipped into the fixed line. He reported fatigue, but confirmed he could continue. During an equipment check, his oxygen mask was observed to have an imperfect seal due to slight misalignment, which the lead Sherpa corrected. The system remained functional, but efficiency was reduced by minor fit issues and condensation buildup. The ascent continued under stable but harsh conditions, with temperatures near -18 degrees Fahrenheit and intermittent wind gusts that periodically forced climbers to pause and secure their grip on the line. Visibility remained clear, and the route ahead was fully visible. Despite these relatively favorable external conditions, Vance's physical performance continued to decline, with slower response times and increasing reliance on rest intervals, indicating progressive physiological strain at altitude. The signs remained subtle rather than dramatic, but they were becoming more frequent and more difficult to ignore. At this stage of ascent on Mount Everest, Vance was no longer moving through the fixed-line system with automatic sequencing. Each action, clipping, stepping, transferring weight, advancing the ascender, required deliberate thought rather than practiced rhythm. The breakdown was not visible as collapse, but as hesitation between actions that should have flowed continuously. Trust me, that description took me a while to fully absorb. The body is still moving, still functioning, but the automatic competence that keeps you alive up there is already gone. At approximately 24,600 feet, the lead Sherpa observed a discrete failure in coordination when Vance reached for his ascender and missed it on the first attempt, before correcting on the second. While the device was properly engaged afterward, the initial miss indicated a lapse in motor accuracy consistent with progressive hypoxic impairment rather than simple fatigue. The Sherpa immediately relayed the observation to the supporting team, and they continued upward while maintaining close monitoring. At approximately 24,800 feet on Mount Everest, the fixed line crossed a short but steeper section of blue ice where precise crampon placement and continuous clipping were essential due to the angle and exposure. The terrain briefly steepened before leveling again, creating a transition zone where small errors in footing or attachment carried immediate consequences. For the previous half hour, Vance's oxygen system had shown intermittent irregularities. The lead Sherpa noted subtle inconsistencies in regulator flow, consistent with partial icing in the valve mechanism. a known issue at extreme altitude where moisture can freeze within the delivery system. While not a full failure, reduced oxygen flow can be difficult for a climber to recognize, as its effects overlap with baseline fatigue and hypoxia-related discomfort already present at that elevation. So, his brain is being asked to diagnose a problem with the very tool it needs to diagnose anything. That's the part that frustrates me most about how this unfolded. Vance stopped on the fixed line at the base of the steeper section, while adjusting his mask and oxygen connection, attempting to identify and correct what he perceived as a flow issue. The lead Sherpa began descending toward him, while the supporting Sherpas held position above and below to maintain system stability. In the subsequent moments, as later reconstructed from Sherpa accounts and physical evidence, Vance became unclipped from the fixed line while managing his ascender and oxygen equipment. Whether intentional or accidental could not be definitively established, but the unclipping occurred while he was positioned on steep blue ice with at least one crampon point not fully engaged. He then attempted to reattach to the line, but lost balance before completing the movement. The movement was not a lunge or a dramatic collapse, but a minor shift in balance that would have been inconsequential at lower elevation. At approximately 24,800 feet on Mount Everest, on steep blue ice while unclipped from the fixed line and operating under reduced coordination from hypoxia and fatigue, that small shift became unrecoverable. His right crampon lost purchase, the left slid under full load, and his hand failed to reach the fixed line in time. He fell an estimated 60 to 80 feet before the rope system partially arrested the descent. The arrest was abrupt rather than controlled, and the force of the fall resulted in multiple impacts against the ice face before tension in the line slowed him. Trauma was consistent with blunt force to the head and chest. The lead Sherpa reached him within minutes, descending as quickly as terrain allowed. Vance was found unresponsive against the fixed line, with his oxygen mask displaced. Oxygen flow was restored, but there was no observable response. Breathing was present, but irregular and shallow. The supporting Sherpas arrived shortly after, and the team secured the body to prevent further movement down the slope. A radio call was made to base camp, but evacuation options at that altitude were extremely limited due to terrain and weather constraints. No helicopter access was possible at that elevation, and any ground recovery would require extensive time and coordination under continued exposure. Despite ongoing oxygen support, there was no improvement in condition. The lead Sherpa continued all available procedures consistent with high-altitude emergency response, but the situation was non-recoverable under the environmental constraints at that location. Recovery efforts began immediately following the incident, but were constrained by the altitude, the angle of the terrain, and the onset of deteriorating wind conditions in the hours after the fall. Vance's body was secured to the fixed line and later moved over the course of multiple stages and with the assistance of additional Sherpa teams dispatched from lower camps to a location below Camp 3 where conditions allowed for safer handling. The full descent to base camp took place over 2 days, with the operation requiring coordination among several teams and significant logistical effort from the expedition operator. Official findings, compiled from the accounts of the Sherpas present, the expedition's medical consultant, and the subsequent review by Nepali mountaineering authorities, concluded that the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head and chest resulting from a high-altitude fall. Contributing factors identified in the findings included hypoxia-related impairment of coordination and judgment, partial regulator icing resulting in inconsistent oxygen delivery in the period immediately preceding the fall, and improper use of safety equipment. Specifically, the unclipping of the safety tether on steep terrain without a secondary anchor point. In plain terms, the reduced oxygen reaching Vance's brain in the final stages of the ascent had degraded his coordination and his ability to manage the sequence of actions required to move safely on the fixed line. And the moment he unclipped, for whatever reason, in whatever state of judgment he was in at that altitude, the margin that had been narrowing for 3 weeks disappeared entirely.
It was the 21st of May, 2017, high on the southeast ridge of Mount Everest. Above the last camp and deep in the thin air climbers call the death zone, where a married couple from Bozeman, Montana, who had spent 2 years telling the world that bottled oxygen and personal climbing Sherpas were a kind of cheating, finally met the one part of that mountain that has never cared how good anyone is. By the time the sun went down that day, the argument they had come to win was over, and it had not gone the way they promised their followers it would. Their names were Dean Ridley, who was 54, and Delia Ridley, who was 51. And they had been married for 26 years and roped together for almost all of them. They lived outside Bozeman, Montana, and the first thing anyone who knew them will tell you is that they were the real thing. These were not weekend tourists who had bought their way onto a mountain. Between them, they had put up hard new routes in the Alps, survived storms high in the Alaska Range, and turned back within sight of summits in Patagonia when the weather told them to. The kind of cold, technical climbing that kills people who are merely good and rewards only the excellent, and they had survived it for 3 decades. They had built a modest but devoted following around a simple and truly old idea in climbing: the belief that a mountain should be met by fair means, under your own power, without bottled oxygen, using the fixed ropes only where the standard route left, no alternative, and without a paid crew carrying your loads and your risk. In the purest corners of the sport, that idea is respected, and Dean and Delia held it like a faith. People who climbed with them describe a couple who were generous, funny, and almost frighteningly calm on dangerous ground, the sort you trusted with your life on a wall in a storm. The trouble was not their skill, which was real, and it was not their courage, which was real too. The trouble was that somewhere along the way their creed had curdled into contempt, and they had started to believe that the crowds on the ordinary Everest, the veterans who guided them, and even the Sherpas who made it all possible, were beneath them. It is a small and human failing, the way being very good at one hard thing can quietly convince a person they are above being taught anything, and on most mountains it would have cost them nothing. Everest is not most mountains. You can still find the way they talked about it in the 2 years before they went because they were proud of the argument and they made it loudly. In several posts, they described the standard Everest as a conga line of tourists dragged up a fixed rope, breathing air out of a bottle so their bodies never had to earn the height. There is a video where Dean calls supplemental oxygen a lie that turns a great mountain into a theme park ride, and another where Delia reads a veteran guide's safety warning out loud in a mocking voice for the camera. They singled out one man in particular, a weathered Norwegian guide named Kurt Rustad, who had guided on Everest for nearly 2 decades, and dismissed him in a clip that circulated in a few climbing forums as a commercial guide who had long since stopped truly climbing, a man selling summits rather than earning them. In the weeks before they left, they laid out their plan as a kind of protest, a statement that the mountain could still be met honestly if only people had the nerve, and a small but loyal climbing audience cheered them on for it. It made them popular in a certain corner of the sport, the ones who like their heroes proud and their mountains conquered. Watching all of it now, knowing exactly what the mountain was quietly waiting to teach them, is a strange and heavy thing. Everest does not care how good you are on rock and ice, and I have watched it take that lesson to climbers far more gifted than the tourists these two love to mock. To understand what went wrong, you have to understand what actually kills people on Everest, because it is almost never the climbing. The standard route up the southeast ridge is not technically hard by the standards of the walls Dean and Delia had spent their lives on. What makes Everest lethal is the altitude itself. The simple fact that above about 26,000 feet, in the zone climbers grimly call the death zone, there is so little oxygen that the human body begins to fail, no matter how fit or skilled it is. The brain can swell, the lungs can fill with fluid, judgment rots, and every hour spent up there is an hour closer to not coming back. This is the whole reason bottled oxygen exists. Not to make the summit easy, but to keep a climber alive long enough to get back down. And the reason experienced teams hire strong Sherpas and set turnaround times they do not break. Climbing Everest without oxygen has been done by a rare few, the greatest high-altitude climbers in history. And even for them, it sits right at the edge of what a person can survive, with a death rate that dwarfs the ordinary route. The cold truth of the place is that the summit is only the halfway point, and that most people who lose their lives on Everest do so on the way down, empty and slow and out of time. Bottled oxygen and a strong support team do not remove that danger, but they blunt it, buying the time and the clear head a tired climber needs to keep moving downhill. The veterans understood all of this in their bones, not as theory but as friends they had lost. Dean and Delia understood the climbing better than most of those veterans, and the altitude not nearly as well as they believed. They had climbed things that would frighten most of us just to look at a photograph of. And I want you to hold on to that because it is exactly what makes this story so hard to explain. At base camp that spring, the warnings came from every direction, and by every account, the couple waved them all away. Kurt Rustad, the veteran they had ridiculed by name, told them once, plainly, that going without oxygen, with no personal Sherpa support up high, and no reserve of bottled air for the way down, in the marginal window they were eyeing, was not a bold statement but a lethal gamble, and that the bottled air and the support they sneered at were the only reasons most people ever came down, and then he left them to it. The senior climbing Sherpas said the same, in fewer words. A seasoned Sirdar named Kairing, who had been high on that mountain dozens of times, warned them that the death zone does not hold debates and does not reward pride, and that he had helped carry down people every bit as strong as they were. He had no reason to lie to them and nothing to sell them, and they dismissed him all the same. According to the people who were there, Dean and Delia heard all of it as the same thing, the self-interest of a guiding industry protecting its business, and they said so at length, and they went back to their tent to prepare. One climber who shared a meal with them that week said the strangest part was how likable they were about it, sure and warm at the same time, as though they truly could not conceive the concern was real. It is worth being fair to them here. They were not stupid, and they were not cowards, and they were not chasing clout in the empty way so many are. They had spent so many years being right about climbing, and being told they were right, that they had lost the ability to imagine being badly wrong about anything close to it. Oxygen was the whole argument for them, the thing they mocked other people for leaning on, and I need you to sit with what it really does up there before you judge how this ends. They did it their way, and for a long time, their way worked, which is part of what makes the story so hard. They acclimatized carefully on their own schedule, they moved beautifully on the mountain, and other climbers who saw them on the lower slopes described a couple who plainly knew exactly what they were doing, faster and cleaner than most of the guided clients around them. They carried no bottled oxygen. They still relied on the basic scaffolding that no one on that mountain can avoid. The permits, the base camp, and the route through the shifting icefall that the icefall doctors rebuild every season. A standard line that exists at all only because rope fixing teams put it there first. But from the high camp upward they climbed independently, without bottled air and without personal climbing Sherpa support above base camp, and they made no secret, even high on the mountain, of how little they thought of the circus around them. They chose a summit day at the edge of a short weather window that the veteran guides considered marginal, with the jet stream forecast to slide back toward the summit and the winds expected to rise, exactly the window Kurt had openly urged them not to use reasoning, as strong alpinists do, that speed and skill would keep them ahead of the risk. It was, in fairness, exactly the kind of calculated gamble that had carried them up harder mountains, where moving fast and light is often safer than moving slow and heavy. The flaw was that those mountains had never asked them to keep functioning for hours in air too thin to think in. On the way up, that reasoning held. They were competent in 100 small ways that lesser climbers are not, efficient with their gear, sure on their feet, reading the ground and the weather with the ease of people who had done it for 30 years. If the mountain were only a climbing problem, they would have solved it the way they had solved so many harder ones. But the mountain is not only a climbing problem. The part that is not, the slow starvation of the body at altitude, does not care how elegantly a person moves, and it was already waiting for them higher up, patient and entirely indifferent to how good they were. Much of what came next is known because the couple filmed themselves, as they always had, and one of their small action cameras was recovered during the later body recovery operation, its memory card still readable. The timestamps and the images fix the shape of the day, the timing and the places and the pace and the sound of their voices, but a camera can only show so much, and it cannot show what was happening inside their bodies or what the two of them understood. There is Dean near the summit ridge in the flat gray light before dawn, breathing hard, giving the camera the same argument he always gave, that the air up here is honest and everyone else is faking it. There is Delia a little higher and a little later, her words slower and thicker than in the clips from lower down, the sentences not quite finishing. There is a summit clip, time stamped well past the hour the veterans would have called a hard turnaround. The two of them together on top of the world with nothing above them, and it is truly a moment of triumph. And then the clips grow short and strange and far apart on the way down, and the timestamps between them stretch, and after a certain point on the descent, there is no more footage at all. It hit me like a truck when Thermal Lance commented that Sherpas must have a VIP waiting room in the afterlife, and I think every one of you watching will feel that too, because you are about to meet one who earned it in a way I'll never forget. From what the other climbers pieced together afterward, they reached the summit at about 1:30 in the afternoon, hours later than any guide would have set as a hard turnaround, and the summit was never the danger. The danger was the long way down, in the thin air, with the afternoon burning away and no reserve of bottled oxygen to steady them, on legs that had already spent everything on the way up. This is the exact trap the death zone sets, and it is the reason the turnaround time the veterans preach is not timidity but arithmetic. Somewhere on the descent from the summit, on the high, exposed ground below the top, one of them began to fail in the way that altitude makes people fail. The slow, stumbling unsteadiness, the fumbled clip, the delayed answer, the small errors of a brain starved of oxygen that experienced climbers dread more than any storm, though the evidence suggests the first subtle signs had most likely begun well before they reached the top. Climbers who passed them on their own descent later described the couple moving slower and slower, then stopping, one of them clearly in serious trouble and the other refusing to leave. That refusal to leave is the detail that has stayed with the people who saw it, because it was the same partnership that had kept them alive for 3 decades, and up there it worked against them. What no one who passed them could do was carry 2 failing adults down through the death zone, because at that altitude, a strong climber can barely carry themselves, let alone another person, and every minute spent trying is a minute stolen from their own descent. This is the quiet horror the veterans had tried to describe, that help is barely possible up there, and that the only real rescue is the one you never need because you turned around in time. Veterans of that mountain are not the soft establishment these two decided that they were. Whatever they told themselves, and I think this is the hardest proof of that I have ever put in front of you. It was Chiring, the senior climbing Sherpa the couple had lumped in with everything they despised, who did the most to try to save them. While descending with his own team, he came upon the couple below the summit, and he sent his clients on down with another Sherpa before staying behind, and by his account and those of others nearby, he did the one thing that might have mattered, which was to fit the mask from a partially full emergency cylinder his team had been carrying over the face of the climber who was worse off, the very bottled air the two of them had spent 2 years mocking. He and a handful of others tried to get them moving, to clip them to the fixed line and coax them into walking, and gave up their own thin margins of safety to do it. But the couple had no supplemental oxygen cached for their own descent, no reserve to fall back on, and they were 2, not 1, and the afternoon was gone. There is a cruel and simple mathematics to a rescue in the death zone, and it had already turned against everyone on that slope. Chiring stayed longer than was safe for himself, working in the cold and the failing light with hands that would pay for it later. But there is a hard limit to what one person can do at that height, and the couple were beyond the point where oxygen and willing hands could turn things around. In the end, the mountain left him the same impossible choice it has left so many Sherpas before, to stay with people he could not save and be lost too, or to go down alone and live. He went down. By all accounts, he did far more than duty asked, and by his own account, it has never once felt like enough. Skills get you up the hard parts, and I wish more than anything that I could tell you skill has ever once talked the death zone out of keeping someone who stayed too long. It is worth being clear about what was happening to their bodies, because it is the whole answer to the argument they came to make. Without supplemental oxygen, at that height, the low oxygen and the extreme altitude can trigger swelling in the brain, fluid building in the lungs, or both, the conditions known as cerebral and pulmonary edema. And among the first things to deteriorate is the judgment a person would need to save themselves. Fitness does not stop it. Skill does not stop it. 30 years of brilliant climbing does not stop it either. The treatment is immediate descent with supplemental oxygen wherever it is available, and by the time the worst of it takes hold, a climber is often already past being able to get down under their own power, which is the whole reason it kills so quietly and so often. Bottled oxygen does not make a person immortal up there, but it buys time and clarity, the two things most likely to get a struggling climber back down alive, the one thing Dean and Delia had refused on principle. There is a bitter symmetry to it. The single thing the couple had built their whole argument around refusing was the thing most likely to have carried them down alive, and they had intentionally carried no supplemental oxygen at all and no backup for the descent. The symptoms the other climbers described were consistent with severe hypoxia and possibly high-altitude cerebral edema. But without any real medical assessment high on the mountain, no one could ever say exactly where exhaustion ended and altitude illness began. It is not a dramatic way to be taken, which is part of why pride is so often underestimated by exactly the sort of strong, capable people most likely to try what these two tried. Pride and courage can look identical from the outside, especially up there, and I still cannot tell you with certainty which of the two carried these two past the point where the mountain lets you turn back. It has to be said plainly that no one was beside them at the very end, and this account will not pretend otherwise. What is known was reconstructed afterward from a handful of honest sources, from Chiring's account of where and when he last saw them alive and the state they were in, from the other climbers who passed the couple on the descent and stopped to help, from the timestamps and the footage on their own recovered cameras, from the radio calls that went back and forth to the high camp that afternoon, and from the places on the mountain where the two of them were later found. What no one can tell you, and what this channel will not pretend to know, is what Dean or Delia were thinking as the light went out of that day, or what passed between a husband and wife in their last hours on the roof of the world, because none of that was recorded and none of it came back down. Dean and Delia Ridley died high on Mount Everest, on the descent from the summit they had just reached, most likely late that afternoon and into the freezing night, of the combined effects of extreme altitude, exhaustion, and cold. They were found afterward on the high slopes below the top, close together, both still clipped to the fixed line, the way the route holds everyone. Chiring survived, and got himself down through the dark to the high camp, frostbitten and hollowed out, and carrying a weight that was never his to carry. Almost everything anyone knows of their final hours is known only because he lived to tell it, and because so many other climbers strung along that same route saw pieces of the end. They were not taken by a fall, or a storm, or a mistake on the technical ground they had mastered decades before, the kind of dramatic end the mountains are famous for. They were taken by the one thing on that mountain their skill could not touch, the simple, patient lack of air, the same quiet killer the veterans had warned them about in the plainest words they had, and they were taken, in the end, by a certainty that had told them right to the summit that the people trying to warn them were simply the ones who did not understand the mountain the way they did. The argument they had come to settle did not end the way anyone would have wanted, and it did not make heroes or villains of anyone. Kurt Rustad, the veteran they had mocked by name, refused every invitation to say he had told them so, and by all accounts grieved two climbers he had truly admired even as they insulted him, saying only that the mountain had made the point he could not. Chiring went back to work on Everest the very next season, because it is what he does and how he feeds his family, and the other Sherpas spoke of him quietly, and with real respect for staying as long as he did on that slope. In the climbing world, the old debate flared up again, about oxygen and fair means, and what is owed to the people who make the mountain possible, sharper this time, because two of the most gifted voices on one side of it were gone. The footage the couple had made became something they never intended, passed around not as the manifesto they meant it to be, but as a warning, and their friends have mostly asked that it be left alone. What almost no one did, to the credit of that world, was celebrate being proven right. The people who had warned them took no pleasure in it, having all lost friends to the same thin air and knowing there was nothing to win. If anything, the loss of two climbers that gifted made the veterans push their message harder, that the mountain is not an opinion to be argued with, and that respect for it is not weakness. Within Nepal's guiding community, it was quietly noted that the couple had broken no rule anyone could point to, that choosing to climb without oxygen is entirely legal and entirely a person's own risk to take, and that this was precisely the problem, because the mountain enforces its own rules long after the human ones run out. Chiring gave up the emergency oxygen his team was carrying to people who had spent 2 years calling men like him hired help, and I do not think I will ever let that leave my mind. I have thought a long time about how to tell this without making Dean and Delia into a punchline, because it would be easy and it would be wrong. They were extraordinary at the thing they had given their lives to, and being extraordinary at one thing had quietly convinced them they could not be badly wrong about another, which is a trap that has nothing to do with mountains and catches almost all of us eventually. The veterans they mocked were not small men guarding a business. They were people who had learned the hard way, and over many years, exactly where that mountain stops caring how good you are, and were trying to say so to two people who had decided in advance not to hear it. There is no villain in this story, only two brilliant, stubborn people who mistook their mastery of the climbing for mastery of the mountain, and a quiet Sherpa who tried to save them with the very thing they had refused. The mountain did not hate them, and it did not respect them either. It simply does not grade on skill, and it never has, and it never will. Something in that last summit clip stays with me. Two people truly happy on top of the world, and I wish I could reach into it and tell them that the hard part was not behind them at all. I do not tell this story to sneer at two people who can no longer answer, because there is nothing to be gained in that, and because the warning in it belongs to all of us, and not just to climbers. Almost every one of us is an expert at something, and quietly believes that being right so often in that one place means the ordinary rules bend for us everywhere else. Everest is one of the last honest things left. A place that takes your genuine brilliance and your years of earned confidence and hands them right back, unimpressed, along with the same terms it offers the tourist and the legend alike, which are oxygen and time or nothing. That is the quiet, uncomfortable lesson under this one. That competence is not the same as wisdom, and that the more certain we are, the less we tend to listen to the people who have already paid for the knowledge we are about to buy. Dean and Delia Ridley were told by people who had every reason to know and no reason to lie that the mountain does not bend for anyone. They climbed toward it certain that it would bend for them, and it let them believe that right up the final ridge and on to the summit, and not one single step further than that.
It was June 20th, 2017. Ang 2 Base Camp sat on the rubble-strewn surface of the Baltoro Glacier at roughly 16,400 feet. The camp was nothing like Everest. No tea houses, nothing like Everest's constant helicopter traffic, no cell service. Just tents scattered across shifting moraine, surrounded by some of the most violent geography on Earth. The Karakoram Peak stacking up in every direction, Broad Peak visible to the south, the Gasherbrums beyond it, and K2 itself rising above everything like something that wasn't designed for people to touch. From down at base camp, it almost looked manageable, this massive white pyramid catching the afternoon light in a way that made it look peaceful, which was basically a lie, and every single one of them sitting in those tents knew it. K2 still had one of the highest fatality rates of any 8,000er, and its reputation had been built on decades of catastrophic expeditions, where small mistakes at altitude turned fatal without warning. The Abruzzi Spur, the standard route from the Pakistan side, rose from base camp through a series of increasingly technical and exposed sections, rock bands, ice fields, mixed terrain, and the infamous bottleneck couloir near the summit where a massive Sirac field hung directly over the climbing route. People showed up every summer thinking their high-altitude trekking experience and their gym fitness would carry them. The mountain had been correcting that assumption for decades. Among the climbers staged at base camp were Enzo Mattei and Lena Falk. Enzo was 27, from Milan, Italy. He was basically a fitness and travel content creator, with a following in the low thousands across platforms. The kind of guy who had built his audience on aesthetic European travel content. Drone shots of coastlines, shirtless hiking reels, that whole world. His feed was curated down to the color grading, everything warm-toned and golden and aspirational. He had that thing where his entire sense of self was kinda tied to the content, like if it wasn't filmed it didn't really happen, and every experience got filtered through the question of whether it would perform. He'd started adding outdoor adventure content the previous year, because the engagement was better, via Ferrata in the Dolomites, trail running in Chamonix, a commercial Everest-based camp trek that he filmed as if it were a summit expedition. No actual high-altitude mountaineering experience beyond guided tourist routes where the infrastructure does all the work. The thing about Enzo was that he genuinely did not understand what K2 was. He talked about it the way he talked about every other trip. Like it was a location with good visuals and high engagement potential. He'd done the Everest base camp trek and treated that as proof he could handle altitude. He'd done Via Ferrata and treated that as proof he could handle exposure. In his mind, K2 was just the next level, a harder version of the same stuff he'd already done. And the fact that he was paying for a guide meant the risk was basically managed. He genuinely thought his fitness and his attitude were enough. That's not me interpreting it. That's what he told other climbers at base camp during the first week. K2 was his idea. He saw it as the video that would break him into serious adventure content, the one that would separate him from every other travel influencer posting the same sunset reels from Santorini. Lena was 25, from Zurich. Enzo's girlfriend of 2 years, lifestyle and wellness content, similar following range. She had grown up in Switzerland surrounded by mountains, but in the hiking and skiing sense, not the climbing sense. She didn't really understand how different K2 was from anything she'd done before. She'd absorbed Enzo's framing of it completely, that it was a big hard trek with some technical bits, that the guide would handle the scary parts, and that if you were fit enough, you'd be fine. She treated base camp like a content retreat. She filmed yoga stretches with K2 in the background. She posted wellness captions about pushing boundaries and trusting the process. The mountain behind her in those shots was the second deadliest peak on Earth, and she was using it as a backdrop for engagement. I've covered a lot of stories where people didn't respect the mountain they were on, but this is the first one where I genuinely think the climbers had no idea what they were walking into. Not because the information wasn't available, because they never thought to look. They joined a small multinational expedition on the Abruzzi Spur with limited fixed support and shared rope-fixing responsibilities between teams. Not a big commercial operation, more like a collection of climbers splitting the cost of permits and base camp logistics. The whole setup was kinda rougher than anything Enzo and Lena had experienced before. No luxury tents, no dedicated cooks, no expedition doctor, just a shared mess tent and whatever you could carry. Other climbers on the expedition noticed them immediately, not because they were loud or rude, but because they treated everything like a shoot. Meal times, gear checks, weather briefings, all of it ended up on camera. Their assigned guide for the summit push was Tariq Hussein, 38, from Hoosh Valley in Baltistan. 6K2 summits via the Abruzzi Spur. He had been climbing in the Karakoram since he was 20, working his way up from low-altitude porter to summit guide over nearly 2 decades. Quiet, efficient, the kind of guide who communicated more through pacing and positioning than words. Like, he'd just slow down when the terrain demanded respect, rather than explain why. He had a reputation for turning clients back when conditions or ability didn't meet the standard, which cost him work but kept people alive. He had a wife and young son in Hoosh. Summit bonuses funded the family through the off-season. Tariq's concern started on the Baltoro approach trek, days before they even reached base camp. Enzo stopped the group multiple times for filming, asking porters to walk past him again so he could get a better angle, setting up shots on glacier crossings while the rest of the team waited. Tariq watched all of it and said nothing until the second week at base camp, when he told the expedition leader that these two did not understand where they were. The leader acknowledged it, but noted they'd paid their fees and hadn't technically done anything disqualifying. Acclimatization rotations ran through late June and into July, cycling through camps 1, 2, and 3 on the Abruzzi Spur. The route climbed through increasingly hostile terrain, from scree and snow slopes below Camp 1 to the steeper mixed climbing of the Black Pyramid between Camps 2 and 3, where fixed ropes threaded through rock chimneys and across ice-glazed ledges. Enzo and Lena performed adequately on the physical side, not elite, not struggling, middle of the pack. Their fitness carried them through the lower sections, but the higher they went, the more obvious it became that fitness was pretty much the only thing they had. Enzo needed repeated reminders during rope transitions and moved far too slowly through anchored sections. He stopped twice on exposed terrain during the Camp 2 rotation to film content. Once on a section where the protocol was to keep moving because rockfall funneled through it every afternoon. Lena was cautious and methodical, which on K2 is actually not a bad quality, but her rope technique was rough and her understanding of the route's danger was surface level at best. Borderline. That word kept coming up in the expedition leader's notes and in Tariq's assessments. Not a hard no, but not the kind of yes that makes anyone comfortable. The problem was that Enzo and Lena didn't know they were borderline. They thought they were doing well. They thought middle of the pack meant ready. Tariq ultimately decided they were barely capable enough if they followed instructions exactly and maintained guide pace without delays during the summit push. Lena had moved competently enough on the fixed ropes to offset some of his concern, and the weather window was genuinely narrow. He set strict conditions, they follow his pace exactly, they don't stop for filming above Camp 3, and they begin descent from the summit no later than 11 a.m. Borderline on K2. I want you to sit with that for a second. When an experienced guide with 6 summits tells you that you're borderline on the second deadliest mountain on Earth, the correct response is to go home. But Enzo didn't hear borderline. He heard good enough, and that's the gap that killed them. The summit window opened in the last week of July. Teams moved to Camp 4 at roughly 25,000 feet on the shoulder, a broad exposed snow platform where wind hit from every direction, and the only thing between you and the sky was the summit pyramid above. Cramped tents, shared oxygen supplies, the cold at Camp 4 just a completely different species of cold than anything below. Sharper, more insistent, the kind that finds you through 4 layers and punishes any exposed surface within seconds. Enzo filmed the camp, the sunset, the summit above them. He did a piece to camera with K2's summit pyramid behind him, talking about tomorrow's climb, like it was already a victory. Tariq noticed Enzo's gear wasn't right. He had brought a camera harness rig that added bulk and created snag hazards on the fixed ropes. Tariq told him to leave it at Camp 4. Enzo negotiated down to a smaller action camera mounted on his helmet, which Tariq allowed because honestly, at that point, arguing about cameras was kinda taking energy away from the conversation he should have been having about whether they should be going at all. They departed Camp 4 around midnight on July 27th. Temperatures sat around -30 Fahrenheit before wind chill. All 3 wore helmets, harnesses, crampons, and down suits. Headlamps traced a line up the shoulder toward the bottleneck, a slow procession of light moving upward through darkness. The climbing began immediately, steep snow and ice, each step deliberate, each breath costing more than the last. K2 doesn't give you a warm-up. Within the first hour above Camp 4, they were in the death zone, where the human body begins deteriorating, regardless of fitness or preparation. Their pace was painfully slow through the bottleneck and the traverse above it. The bottleneck is a steep couloir at roughly 26,000 to 27,000 feet, where a massive serac field, hundreds of feet tall and thousands of tons heavy, hangs directly above the climbing route. Every K2 climber knows the rule. You move through as fast as possible, you never stop. Enzo fumbled rope transitions, taking like twice as long as a competent climber to clip, unclip, and move through anchored sections. Lena froze briefly on the traverse, a narrow band of exposed ice where the route crosses directly beneath the serac field and the drop below disappears into thousands of feet of nothing. She pressed herself against the slope and didn't move for almost 2 minutes. Tariq talked her through it calmly, step by step, but the minutes bled away, and each one cost them margin they couldn't get back. They created a bottleneck behind them on the fixed ropes. Other teams stacked up, waiting for Enzo and Lena to clear sections that competent climbers would have moved through in half the time. Other guides exchanged looks. One of them said something to Tariq and Balti that he didn't respond to, but it was pretty clear from the tone that it wasn't a compliment. The unspoken rule on K2 is that you move through the bottleneck as fast as possible, or you don't belong there. Enzo and Lena were doing neither. By the time they cleared the traverse and reached the upper snowfield, they were already over an hour behind the typical schedule. Tariq considered turning them back here. This was the moment where years of experience told him to stop. He told them they were behind and that the summit was still roughly 2 hours away at their pace, which put them dangerously close to the window where afternoon sun begins warming the seracs above the bottleneck. Enzo argued they'd come too far to turn back, which honestly is the most predictable thing he could have said, because that's pretty much what every person says at that point on any mountain. Coming too far is not a reason to keep going, but it feels like one when you're standing there exhausted and the summit is right above you. Lena sided with him. Tariq set a hard turnaround. If they hadn't reached the summit by 11 a.m., they were going down no matter what, because after that, the sun starts hitting the seracs above the bottleneck, and that's when the ice starts calving, and that's when people die. That's where this story should have ended, right there on the upper snowfield. Turn around, descend, try again next year with better skills. But turning around means no summit video, no content, no proof. And for 2 people who had treated this entire expedition as a content shoot from day 1, going back empty-handed was unthinkable. They reached the summit at around 11:20 a.m., 20 minutes past the hard turnaround. Most teams that had summited earlier that morning were already well into their descent through the bottleneck by this point. The view from the summit of K2 is one of the most extreme panoramas on Earth. The entire Karakoram visible in every direction. Broad Peak, the Gasherbrams, Masherbram, all of it laid out below at a scale that doesn't look real. Enzo immediately started filming. Lena posed against the summit marker. They shot angles for their platforms, cycling through poses while Tariq stood to the side, watching the time. Tariq gave them 5 minutes, then told them to move. Enzo asked for more time because the light wasn't right yet, and he wanted to wait for a cloud layer below to shift so the background would be cleaner. The 5 became 20. By the time they actually started moving off the summit, it was past 11:40 a.m. a.m. Tariq believed they still had enough time to descend safely if they moved continuously and stayed strictly on the standard route. Total time on the summit was roughly 35 minutes. On K2, standard summit time is 5 to 10 minutes maximum because the summit is not where the danger is. The descent through the bottleneck is, and every minute on top is a minute stolen from the margin that keeps you alive going down. 20 extra minutes, that's what killed them. Not the mountain, not the seracs, not the couloir. 20 minutes waiting for a cloud to move so the background of a video would look better. I've covered a lot of last decisions on this channel. This one is the hardest to sit with. The descent is where K2 kills. Down climbing steep ice and navigating fixed ropes through the death zone is harder than going up because exhaustion magnifies every mistake. The altitude is crushing your judgment by the minute, and the bottleneck has to be crossed again. This time, with the afternoon sun directly warming the serac field above. Most clients have never experienced what it feels like to descend through a section where thousands of tons of unstable ice are hanging directly over your head, and the only thing between you and it is speed. Enzo and Lena were even slower going down than they had been going up. Exhaustion, hypoxia, the altitude at 28,000 feet doing real damage to their coordination and decision-making with every passing hour. Tariq was short roping them through the worst sections, physically managing their movement step by step, placing their hands on clips, calling out foot placements. It was exhausting work for a guide, the kind of sustained physical and mental effort that just drains everything. And it was taking twice as long as a normal descent. Every other team that had summited around the same time was already below the bottleneck and pulling further ahead. They reached the top of the bottleneck couloir in early afternoon. The sun had been hitting the seracs for hours. The ice above was groaning, deep structural sounds that meant the frozen mass was expanding and shifting as it warmed. Debris had already fallen across sections of the route below. Chunks of ice scattered across the couloir, where climbers had been walking hours earlier. More than a dozen climbers were queued at the top of the bottleneck, all trying to descend the same fixed rope line through the couloir one at a time. Estimated wait, 30 to 40 minutes, standing directly beneath the serac field, while the afternoon sun continued warming everything above them. Enzo spotted what looked like a faster line to the left of the crowded fixed ropes, a snow couloir that appeared to bypass the bottleneck and rejoin the main route further down. From their position above, the couloir looked like it merged naturally back into the descent line below. It looked open, it looked clear, and most importantly, nobody was in it, which to Enzo probably looked like an opportunity when it was actually the biggest warning sign on the entire mountain. Tariq shut it down immediately. That couloir was basically a funnel for every piece of ice debris coming off the serac field above. And the reason nobody was in it was because every guide on K2 knew exactly what it was and made sure their clients avoided it. In afternoon conditions with the sun directly on the seracs, that couloir was not a route. It was a kill zone. Enzo pushed back. They'd been standing still for almost 10 minutes beneath the serac field, while debris fell intermittently around them. He argued the couloir looked clear, and they could move through it fast enough to avoid anything from above. He pointed down and traced what he saw as a clean line of descent, maybe 200 feet of straightforward down climbing, before it reconnected with the main route below. He said it would take 5 minutes. The thing is, it genuinely did look passable from where they were standing. That's the trap. Serac debris couloirs look fine between events. The evidence of what they actually do pretty much gets swept clean by each new cycle of ice. Lena looked at the queue, looked at the couloir, and said nothing, which Enzo interpreted as agreement. He unclipped from the fixed line and started moving toward the couloir entrance on his own. He didn't look back at Tariq. He didn't wait for Lena to clip in. He just went, the way he'd been going all day, forward, confident, certain that momentum and attitude would carry him through something that required neither. Tariq shouted for them to stop and come back to the fixed line, but Enzo kept descending. Lena hesitated for a few seconds, looked at Tariq, then followed him. Tariq was now in the worst position a guide can be in. 2 unroped clients walking into a serac debris couloir in afternoon conditions on K2. Years of guiding, and he had never once let a client enter that couloir. He had pointed it out on every descent, explained what it was, watched clients look at it and nod and stay on the route. And now 2 people he was responsible for were already inside it. His options were to let them go alone or follow them into a place he had spent his entire career teaching people to avoid. He followed. I've said this before on this channel, but the guide always follows. They always follow, even when the client has already made the decision that's going to kill everyone. Because leaving them alone is the one thing a guide can't live with afterward, even when following is the thing that ends their career. They were maybe 60 feet into the couloir when it happened. The sound came first, a deep crack from somewhere above, then a roar that built faster than the brain could process. Ice calved from the Serac band above the bottleneck. Not the entire face, but enough. A massive slab broke loose and triggered a cascade of ice debris straight down the couloir, accelerating as it fell, picking up more ice and snow as it went, directly over the section where they were standing. The couloir concentrated everything. That's what couloirs do on mountains. They collect debris from a wide area above and compress it into a narrow stream below, and anyone standing in that stream has pretty much nowhere to go. Tariq was at the couloir entrance, partially sheltered by a rock rib where the couloir met the main route. He pressed himself flat against the stone. Debris blasted past him. A chunk of ice struck his dominant left hand, crushing 2 fingers against the rock. He felt the bones break, but the adrenaline was already flooding, and he didn't really process the pain until later, which is pretty much how it always works with impact injuries at altitude. Enzo and Lena were in the center of the couloir with no shelter of any kind. Enzo was struck by ice debris and swept roughly 200 feet down the couloir, before one surviving anchor on the fixed line below arrested what was left of his fall. The impact was catastrophic and unsurvivable. Lena was hit in the shoulder and back. She fell a shorter distance, maybe 40 feet, and came to rest against a rock band partially buried in debris. She was alive initially, but barely. Tariq reached her within minutes despite his crushed hand, down climbing into the couloir with blood running from his fingers and ice still falling intermittently around him. By the time he got to her, she was unresponsive, her breathing agonal and shallow, showing signs of severe internal trauma that field medicine cannot reverse at 27,000 feet. Radio calls went down to Camp 4 almost immediately, but everyone understood the same reality. She died before any rescue could reach them. Tariq stayed with her the entire time. At that altitude and in those conditions, no helicopter could reach them, and no rescue team could arrive fast enough to matter. He sat beside her for over an hour with 2 broken fingers wrapped in a torn glove liner and a woman he couldn't save lying next to him. He didn't move. He didn't radio. He just sat there. Tariq sat with her for over an hour at 27,000 feet. I keep thinking about what that hour felt like. Years of guiding on K2 without a single client fatality. And then one afternoon, one couloir, and all of it gone. Enzo Matei's body was recovered from the couloir by a team the following day. Lena Falk was carried down to Camp 4 by Tariq and 2 other guides who reached them once conditions allowed movement. Tariq lost 2 fingers on his dominant left hand in surgery at a hospital in Skardu. The grip strength loss ended his technical guiding career, which is kinda the cruelest part of this whole thing, because he did everything right and still lost everything. He took lower altitude porter work, but never returned to the upper mountain. Colleagues said the psychological damage was worse than the physical. He reportedly told a friend he could still hear the ice in the couloir. Their social media accounts remained active for weeks after their deaths. Scheduled posts continued publishing automatically, Enzo's travel reels and Lena's wellness content appearing in feeds long after both of them were gone. People who didn't know yet were still liking and commenting on posts that had been queued up before the climb. That detail is honestly one of the most unsettling things I've come across in any story I've covered on this channel. The idea that your digital life just keeps going after you're gone, and nobody watching knows the difference. The expedition company reportedly tightened client screening protocols after the accident.